Long before the rise of the Knights Templar, before the Crusades, and before the hidden vaults of Jerusalem were unearthed, there was another secret. A forgotten dynasty, a bloodline shrouded in myth, mystery, and divine right. The Merovingians, rulers of the ancient Franks, were said to be more than kings. They were believed to be descendants of something otherworldly, sacred, chosen. Their symbols carved into stone, their secrets whispered across generations. What if their lineage held the key to understanding the true origins of the Templar order? What if the power that shaped Europe's destiny was never truly lost, only hidden? Tonight, we journey into the shadows of forgotten history, to unlock the code behind a royal bloodline, one that may have guarded the greatest secrets of all time. This is the Merovingian code, the bloodline before the Templars. What if Jesus had children? What if his bloodline didn't end at the cross, but was carried in secret across oceans of time, protected by kings, concealed by knights, and hunted by popes? What if the Holy Grail was never a cup at all, but a living, breathing lineage, one that still exists today? You've heard fragments? Dan Brown, Da Vinci, Templars. But beneath the fiction lies something older and far stranger. A royal family erased from history. A code written not in ink, but in blood. And now, after centuries of silence, the story is whispering again. But to hear it, really hear it, you have to slow down. Let the centuries peel back. Let the myths fall silent. Let your breath match the rhythm of old stone halls where forgotten kings once walked. This isn't just a story. It's a revelation that stretches across empires, churches, and graves. It begins, as many secrets do, with a death. The year was 679. A chill crept across the woods of the Ardennes. The birds had gone quiet, and in the shadows of a Roman road, something sacred was shattered. Dagobert II, the last fully sovereign king of the Merovingian line, was murdered, allegedly on the orders of the church. A spear to the eye, or maybe a knife to the throat. No chronicler agrees. But what they do agree on is that Dagobert was the last obstacle. And once he fell, the door opened to a new age of rulers. Ones more compliant, more useful, and most importantly, ones without divine blood. Because that's what the Merovingians claimed. Not merely to be royalty, not merely to be chosen, but to be descended directly from the sacred, a bloodline stretching back not just to David, not just to Abraham, but beyond that, to Galilee, to a carpenter, to a woman with red hair fleeing by boat, her belly full of prophecy. It sounds impossible, outlandish, like something from the margins of a conspiracy forum. But history has always hidden its truths best when they're disguised as lunacy. And as you'll see, the deeper you go into this story, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The Merovingians ruled much of what is now France, Belgium, and Germany. Their kings were marked by strange traditions, never cutting their hair, claiming visions, wielding power through mysticism rather than force. They were revered as God-chosen, even feared as semi-divine. But then, suddenly, they were gone. Quietly, bloodlessly, erased from power and eventually from the record. Their names scrubbed, their tombs hidden, their children hunted, and in their place came the Carolingians, the dynasty that gave us Charlemagne, the dynasty the Church wanted in power. Now, centuries later, clues to the Merovingian past are re-emerging. Coded texts, secret societies, lost gospels, whispered names, and always the same lingering question. Why did the Church try so hard to make us forget them? Some say it's because the Merovingians were heretics.
Others say they were too powerful, too independent, too magical. But the most dangerous theory of all, the one we'll explore tonight, is that the Merovingians were removed not because of what they did, but because of who they were. And more frightening still, because of who they still might be. Because blood doesn't vanish. It flows through centuries, through generations, through veins, and perhaps, just perhaps, through someone alive today. So settle in, dim the lights, let your curiosity stretch its legs, and allow your doubts to nap in the corner for a while. You're about to step into a mystery older than kings, deeper than dogma, and sharper than any sword ever raised in its defense. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You picture it now. Deep forest, pale mist rising from damp leaves, and the heavy scent of pine and silence. The year is 679. Somewhere along the Ardennes, a hunting party moves with uneasy quiet. Among them rides Dagobert II, King of Australia, wrapped in a heavy cloak of royal blue. His face is lined, but his eyes burn bright with something that doesn't belong in these woods, something like purpose. It would be the last journey he ever made. History tells us little of the moments before his death. One account claims he was isolated from his guard. Another says he was betrayed by a servant. Either way, the king was murdered, and what followed was even stranger than the silence of his death. The chroniclers stopped writing, not just about Dagobert, but about the line he came from. It was as if the ink froze in midair, and the royal blood spilled quietly into the dirt, unremembered. Dagobert II wasn't a rebel or a failed monarch. On the contrary, he had only recently returned from exile in Ireland, where he'd lived under the protection of the Church. He was restored to the throne with the blessings of bishops and nobles alike, suggesting he had allies in high places. Yet just a few short years later, he was gone, assassinated under mysterious circumstances and with almost no recorded outrage. That in itself raises eyebrows. Monarchs don't just vanish without consequence unless someone wanted him gone and wanted him forgotten. Now, here's the curious part. Dagobert's son Sigisbert should have inherited the throne. By all accounts, he was alive, a legitimate heir, but he never ruled. No crowning, no ceremony, no resistance, nothing. His name slipped from the annals of official history, like a stone tossed into a deep, dark well. Some whisper he fled to the south, to the region now called Languedoc. Others say he was hidden by monks loyal to the Merovingian cause. A few bolder voices, rare and often laughed off, claim he was taken to a small village in the Pyrenees, where he lived under another name, and where his descendants still walk today. It all smells like a cover-up, and if you're feeling that gentle tingle down your spine, you're not alone. Because Dagobert II wasn't just a king. He was the last of a very specific kind of king. His family, the Merovingians, claimed something older than conquest or crown. They claimed divine blood. To understand why his death mattered so much, you need to look at what the Merovingians believed about themselves. Unlike most dynasties that leaned on military strength or divine right through papal endorsement, the Merovingians saw themselves as sacred by birth. Long hair was never cut, believed to be a vessel of spiritual power. Their kings were said to be born under celestial signs, capable of healing by touch and gifted with visions. Their authority didn't just come from Rome. It came from the heavens. This wasn't political posturing. These beliefs were baked into the bones of their rule. And for many early Christians, that blurred the line between king and saint in unsettling ways. A monarch who didn't need the church to legitimize him was dangerous, particularly one who whispered of an ancient bloodline, stretching not just back to David, but further to Galilee, to that quiet fisherman's son who died on a Roman cross and may have left behind more than teachings. Of course, mainstream history scoffs. There's no academic consensus that Jesus had children. The canonical Gospels are silent on the matter, and any suggestion otherwise is quickly branded speculative, if not outright heretical. But even so, fringe documents, Gnostic Gospels, and oral traditions persist.
The Gospel of Philip, for example, speaks curiously of Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene, calling her his companion, a term whose Greek roots can imply a spouse. Interpretations vary, scholars argue, and certainty slips like water through fingers. Still, the idea persisted, especially in pockets of Europe where Roman oversight was weaker and older traditions clung like moss to old stone. The Merovingians, ruling Gaul in the post-Roman vacuum, had ample room to forge their myths, and if those myths involved sacred ancestry, you can see how the Church, desperate to assert orthodoxy and control, might view them as a threat. And here lies the real tension. If Dagobert II died because of his beliefs, or worse, because of his blood, then his assassination wasn't just political. It was theological. A crime committed not merely to seize a throne, but to suppress a legacy. One of the strangest details supporting this view comes not from an ancient scroll, but from a 20th century document known as the Dossier Serres Dunlabino, filed quietly in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This modern text claims that Dagobert's line continued in secret, protected by a society known as the Priory of Sion. According to the dossier, Sigebert IV survived and eventually founded a new dynasty in the south, one that never claimed its rights, but quietly maintained its blood. The document is controversial. Many believe it's a hoax, a mid-century invention, but its inclusion of obscure medieval details, like the layout of certain tombs and heraldic lineages, has puzzled even its critics. And more curiously, the dossier appeared long before the Da Vinci Code popularized these ideas. In other words, someone was whispering this story long before it became cool to chase grails through cathedrals. It raises a question that still floats unanswered above the forest floor where Dagobert fell. If there was nothing to hide, why was so much effort made to erase him? Not just politically, but spiritually, symbolically, genealogically. The silence around Dagobert's assets doesn't feel like a historical footnote. It feels like a redacted paragraph, a space where something holy or dangerous once stood. And that silence has echoes. You stand now in a shadowed hall of memory, a place that smells of incense and iron, where the light is always slightly dimmed by something ancient. The floor is stone, and the air carries the hushed reverence of an old cathedral. At the far end, a throne, not gilded, but carved from dark wood, entangled with serpents, bees, and curling vines. No crown rests upon it, only a single lock of long golden hair. Welcome to the world of the Merovingian kings, not just of land, but of legend. They weren't like the others. From the 5th to the 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty ruled over large swaths of what we now call France and Western Europe. They were the Rex sine coinatis, the long-haired kings, a title that wasn't fashionably poetic. It was spiritual law. A Merovingian ruler was never to cut his hair. It was said to house their sacred power, their divine sanction. To shear a Merovingian was to strip him of his right to rule. A trimmed head was no longer holy. It was political heresy, like yanking out the very soul of the state with scissors. This wasn't superstition born from vanity. The tradition likely emerged from pre-Christian roots, Druidic and pagan beliefs woven with early Christian mythology. In some ways, the Merovingians were syncretic rulers, fusing the old gods and the new gospel. Their kings were said to possess prophetic dreams, anointed destinies, and healing touches, echoes of both Celtic seers and biblical figures. Their people didn't just fear them, they venerated them. One of the earliest kings, Clovis Wine, provides a pivotal lens. In 496, he converted to Christianity, Roman Christianity to be precise, and was baptized in Reims, allegedly with the descent of a dove and a vial of holy oil from heaven itself. Yes, it's dramatic, but more than miracle, this marked a quiet submission, a shifting of loyalties from the old gods of Gaul to the rising power of the Latin Church. Still, even under this Christian veneer, strange things bubbled beneath the surface. Clovis's lineage, according to later legends, was not entirely of this world. His supposed ancestor, Merave, the dynasty's namesake, was said to be born from a sea creature. Perhaps a quinator, a bull-headed sea beast, Or maybe something closer to Neptune. Again, it sounds absurd, but remember, ancient symbolism often wrapped deeper truths in mythological skins.
Merovec's oceanic origin might have signified an otherworldly bloodline, something ancient, pure, and deliberately set apart from the ordinary mortal line. It's this blend, half myth, half history, that gave the Merovingians their power. They didn't rely solely on armies or taxation. Their rule was mystical, bound to the land and people through something deeper than politics. Their kings weren't just rulers, they were symbols, living relics, which makes their eventual erasure even more suspicious. Because here's the strange historical fact. By the time Dagobert II died, the Merovingian line had lost most of its political power. In name, they were still kings, but in truth, the kingdom was run by the mayors of the palace, chief officials who controlled administration, finances, and armies. These mayors were the protégés, the smiling bureaucrats behind the curtain. And most notably, the line of mayors included one Pepin of Herstal, whose descendant, Pepin the Short, would eventually seize the crown and start the Carolingian dynasty. This transition was not a bloody coup. It was a slow fade of bureaucratic whisper. The Merovingians were gradually rendered symbolic. When their usefulness expired, they were quietly retired to monasteries. Haircut, titles revoked, bloodline diluted into nothing more than a forgotten branch on the royal family tree. But here's the question that lingers like candle smoke. Why all the ceremonial effort to disempower without destroying? If the Merovingians had become irrelevant, why not execute them, banish them violently? Why tuck them away into quiet cloisters, slowly erasing their memory, while allowing the family itself, at least in name, to remain? The answer might lie in fear, or reverence, or something stranger still. Some believe the Church saw the Merovingians not merely as obsolete rulers, but as rivals to Christ himself. If the Merovingians truly believed themselves descended from Jesus through Mary Magdalene and a secret child, then their claim to power would threaten not just kingship, but doctrine. Christianity's foundation hinges on the idea of divine sacrifice, not divine succession. A Jesus who left behind a lineage is a Jesus grounded in blood, not solely in spirit. That would make the Merovingians living heresy. And heresy is far more dangerous when it walks, talks, and claims a throne. Adding a surreal twist to this already murky history is an obscure Merovingian practice known as divine vision. In several surviving chronicles, kings were described as having the power to see signs before battle, dream of future events, or experience sacred sleep. One tale speaks of King Gundrum, who supposedly healed a leper with a kiss and was later canonized. Another describes Dagobert I dreaming of his own assassination years before it occurred. These aren't normal kingly behaviors. These are prophetic motifs, biblical patterns woven into medieval lives. Skeptics would say it's hagiography,
embellishment to boost fame. But what if these tales weren't about exaggerating history, but preserving coded truths? That's where the modern debate begins to fracture. Some scholars argue the Merovingians were just one of many dynasties mythologized after the fact. Others, especially those outside mainstream academia, suspect a deliberate suppression orchestrated by church scribes to protect orthodoxy. Even today, that argument continues, raging mostly in quiet corners of esoteric conferences and footnotes of niche journals. Did the Merovingians truly believe they were descended from Jesus? Or did someone else want them to believe that, to use them, elevate them, and eventually erase them once their purpose was served? There's no proof, not in the academic sense, but there is suggestion. The fragments of hair relics kept in monasteries, the odd consistencies in legends across France, the suppressed Gospels, the shrines to Magdalene built in places she shouldn't have been, and always the symbols, the bees, the fleur-de-lis, the five-pointed stars carved into stone as if waiting for someone to finally see them. When Dagobah II died, the silence wasn't just political, it was mythic. The curtain fell not just on a man, but on a mystery. And you can still feel it if you try.
You drift now beneath vaulted stone, where silence hums like a hymn too ancient for words. The Basilica of Saint-Denis looms over the outskirts of Paris like a grand reliquary for monarchs, a kind of necropolis castle hybrid, half cathedral, half memory palace. Nearly every king of France lies here, their names etched in marble. Their crowns, long since oxidized, now rest in museum cases. But here, under all that pageantry and ritual, lies a whisper the guides never mention. The tomb of Dagobah II is missing. Or more accurately, it's not where it should be. Which is odd, isn't it? This is Saint-Denis, hallowed ground, a place obsessed with housing the bones of royalty. Clovis is here, so are Charlemagne's heirs, but not Dagobah II. Instead, in a curious twist of legacy, Dagobah, the one his grandfather, is interred here with full honors. There's even a carved inscription declaring his eternal rest. But his descendant, the murdered king, is absent from the official registry of saints, sovereigns, and sepulchres. And yet there are whispers, subtle, frustrating, persistent. In 872, a monk named Hincmar of Reims wrote of a vision divinely inspired in which he was told Dagobah II was a saint, martyred unjustly, and resting beneath the church at Stenay, far to the east. That claim led to the discovery of a tomb there, and for a time Dagobah was even locally venerated as a saint. His feast day was marked. Pilgrims came. A chapel was built in his honor. But then the story takes a familiar turn. Silence. Veneration was discouraged. The church grew strangely tight-lipped. By the early 12th century, the cult of Saint Dagobard had quietly vanished, not condemned, not debunked, just erased. So what lies beneath Stenay? According to some accounts, bones were found. Not just one burial, but several. An entire royal configuration. A king, a woman, and a child. Their identities were never confirmed, and little physical evidence remains today.
thanks in part to revolutions, wars, and renovations that treated old tombs like furniture. But rumors persist, not just of remains, but of objects, a sigil carved in stone, a relic box sealed with wax and marked with a now extinct crest, and in one particularly strange account, a small scroll of vellum with Hebrew lettering. None of these findings were ever publicly verified, of course, and those who investigated too far, like a certain Father Saunier, whom we'll meet again soon, often found themselves discouraged, exiled, or mysteriously enriched. This brings us to the obscure detail that nags at historians like a pebble in the boot. In 1653, a document surfaced in the Vatican archives, known as the Chronicon Sionis. It described a hidden tomb under Saint-Denis, not the Grand Basilica as we see it today, but an older chamber, sealed and forgotten, containing a king of divine root, silenced by Rome, watched by bees. That phrase, watched by bees, has baffled researchers for decades. Bees were a Merovingian symbol, yes, but how would a 17th-century document reference a motif that had been culturally dead for nearly a millennium? Some say forgery, others say coincidence, but a few believe the chronic is a breadcrumb, one that points to a deliberate burial under the very place where kings were meant to be celebrated, not hidden. And here lies the uncomfortable question. If a secret tomb does exist under Saint-Denis, why hasn't it been unearthed? The French government has funded restorations of the basilica many times. Engineers and archaeologists have mapped much of the substructure. And yet, beneath certain sealed sections of the crypt, no excavation is permitted. One official explanation blames structural integrity. Those chambers are simply too unstable, too risky to disturb. But when has risk ever stopped the modern world from drilling for oil, rebuilding cathedrals, or repaving the past? What if, instead, something lies beneath that is meant to remain sealed? There are also curious accounts from Napoleonic times. When Napoleon visited Saint-Denis in 1806, he reportedly asked to view the royal tombs. After a long private viewing, he remarked almost offhandedly that some kings leave no name, only a legacy of silence. That line, quoted later in his journals, has led to speculation that Napoleon may have seen something the public did not. Some even suggest he borrowed Merovingian imagery for his own imperial regalia, specifically the bee. And here's where things take an even stranger turn. The bee, long forgotten as a royal symbol, suddenly re-emerged in Napoleon's empire, embroidered into robes, sewn into banners, etched into imperial seals. Why he claimed it was a symbol of French industriousness?
But others believe he was nodding to a deeper lineage, a way of declaring himself heir, not just to Rome, but to the oldest French bloodline hall. So we return to Dagobert II, a king erased, a saint desanctified, a tomb misplaced, and yet his name lingers on local chapels, half-erased documents, and a few too many conspiracy-laced footnotes. His presence is felt, not in the grand narratives of French history, but in the gaps, the omissions, the silences. Modern scholars remain divided. Some say the missing tomb is a historical oddity, nothing more. Others suspect political sabotage. But the most intriguing theory of all is the one you're beginning to sense. Like a pressure beneath the cathedral stones, that Dagobert II was buried with something that couldn't be exposed. A scroll, a gospel, a genealogy, something that would unravel the delicate weave of Christian legitimacy if ever brought to light. And so rather than destroy him, they hid him. But bones don't stay quiet forever, especially when the land remembers. and in the village of Stenay, where the wind still carries the smell of wet earth and linen blossom, locals speak of dreams, of a tall man in blue, of a queen who never speaks, and a boy holding a golden orb watching from the chapel door. Whether they're memories or myths hardly matters anymore. Either way, the tomb is whispering. Can you hear it? Imagine a dim reading room in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, mahogany paneled, quiet enough to hear the scratch of a fountain pen. In 1975, a researcher named Pierre Plantard walks into this room and files a strange set of documents under an even stranger name, Dossier Sri Lobinol. On their own, these papers seem eccentric. Genealogical charts, obscure correspondences, lists of grand masters of a supposed secret society called the Priory of Sion. But within their tangled calligraphy lies the spark that would ignite the modern Grail mythos and change how we view European history forever. These dossiers, archival ghosts planted without context, claimed something extraordinary, that the Merovingian bloodline had not died, but had simply gone underground. According to these pages, Dagobert II's son, Sigisbert IV, had escaped assassination and taken refuge in the Languedoc region of southern France. From there, his descendants continued in secrecy, protected by an ancient brotherhood, sworn to preserve the sacred bloodline of Christ. A bold claim, and yet buried within the flamboyant storytelling was something quietly unsettling. Details too precise, too obscure to dismiss outright. Ancient family trees listed obscure nobles, their titles meticulously cross-referenced. There were seals resembling early Merovingian symbology, even references to real historical figures like Bertrand de Blanquefort, a Grand Master of the Knights Templar, whose lives suddenly appeared reinterpreted through the lens of guardianship, not warfare. The Priory of Sion, the documents claimed, had existed since at least the 11th century, possibly earlier, not merely as a religious society or monastic order, but as the shadow hand behind major European events. Protectors of a bloodline so powerful it threatened the very structure of church and empire, and their mission to preserve the Grail. Not the chalice, but the line, the sang royal, royal blood. You might feel the tug of skepticism tighten just behind your eyes. Fair enough. After all, the Priory of Sion has long been a historical curiosity with very little hard proof. Plantard himself was later exposed for embellishment, even invention. But here's the twist. Although parts of the dossier were fabricated, not all of it was false. Some genealogies have been verified. Some tombs referenced only in the documents were found right where they were described. Even the list of supposed Grand Masters includes names like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo, so absurdly high profile that it either screams hoax or deliberate distraction. There's also the problem of timing. The dossier appeared before the Grail craze exploded into popular culture, long before the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, before Dan Brown, before whispered tours of Rosslyn Chapel. So if this was merely a hoax, it was astonishingly prescient. And then there's the Lobinol map, an innocuous addition to the dossier containing subtle symbols laid over the region of Rennes-le-Château. Those symbols later aligned, albeit loosely, with topographical anomalies that had been the subject of local legends for centuries. In one case, a ridgeline marked with an 8-pointed star matched almost perfectly the foundation of a ruined Templar outpost.
Coincidence? Possibly. But the pattern is there, whether you believe it or not. Historians continued to wrestle with this. Some dismissed the dossier as elaborate fantasy. Others acknowledged that while Plantard may have embellished, he likely believed the core of what he published. He even claimed under oath in a French court to be a direct descendant of the Merovingians. That part didn't hold under legal scrutiny. But curiously, the court didn't prosecute him for fraud. The matter was dropped quietly, without further public inquiry. So the question isn't just whether the Priory of Sion exists, it's whether it ever needed to. Throughout history, noble families have preserved their lineages with obsessive care. Cloistered daughters, strategic marriages, hidden heirs. None of this is new. What is unusual is the religious weight attached to the Merovingian bloodline. If the Church believed these claims even slightly, the political risk would have been staggering. A bloodline claiming descent from Jesus would undermine centuries of papal authority. The Church's hierarchy would no longer be the mediator between God and man, because the mediator would be walking, breathing, ruling. Which may be why in certain Vatican records there are notations about potential heretical lines. Most are vague, dismissive, but some, curiously redacted, reference unnamed French families and unusual patterns of inheritance. The dossier also mention something chilling: a vault somewhere beneath the Pyrenees, allegedly holding the Merovingian genealogy along with sacred artifacts, perhaps even the bones of Magdalene herself. Again, no proof, just an idea. But this idea has been enough to spur generations of treasure hunters, scholars, and secret societies into quiet obsession. And this brings us to an uncomfortable observation. Whether or not the Priory of Sion exists as an organized body, the effect of the idea has been enormous. Since the release of the dossiers, there's been a measurable uptick in encrypted texts, fringe archaeological digs, and accidental discoveries that link back somehow to this story. A mosaic found in a ruined church depicting a red-haired woman holding a chalice. A forgotten painting of a king in blue robes, watched over by bees. A gravestone unearthed in silence that bore no name, only a Latin phrase: sanguis non mortur. Blood does not die. Is all of this a coincidence? A pattern born from the mind's need to connect dots where none exist? Or is it something more deliberate, like echoes of a truth that refuse to stay buried? Even among skeptics, there is reluctant agreement the idea of the Priory of Sion has teeth. It has structure, language, and just enough grounding in actual history to make it dangerous, which is precisely what makes it so effective. So perhaps the dossiers were never meant to prove the existence of a secret society. Perhaps they were a smoke signal, an invitation to look again at the cracks in the cathedral walls, the absences in royal registers, the names spoken in dreams, but not in records. After all, secrets rarely shout. They whisper, sometimes in ancient parchment, sometimes through missing tombs, and sometimes, more unsettlingly, in plain sight. Picture a weathered fortress at dawn, its turrets wrapped in morning mist. Beneath its stone vaults, a group of knights kneels in silence, their white mantles marked by a red cross, swords laid upon the altar like sacred relics. This is not merely a military order. It is a ritual in motion, a mystery encoded in obedience. And at the heart of it, if the stories are to be believed, is a secret older than any sword, more potent than any oath. The bloodline they may have sworn to protect. The Knights Templar, warrior monks of the Holy Land, defenders of pilgrims, founders of Europe's first international banking network, have long been at the center of religious fascination. Their rise was meteoric. From humble beginnings in 1119 as protectors of a single road in Jerusalem, they grew into one of the most powerful forces in Christendom. Popes blessed them, kings feared them, and within a century their order stretched from Portugal to Palestine, with castles, farms, fleets, and vaults stuffed with gold and secrets. But what exactly were they guarding? The official version tells us they protected pilgrims, fought in crusades, and served as shock troops of Christian orthodoxy.
But alternative accounts, often dismissed as fringe, tell a deeper tale. A story that connects the Templars not just to Jerusalem, but to something beneath it. Shortly after their formation, the Templars set up headquarters on the Temple Mount in what had once been the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This spot, tradition holds, was built atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. And while officially there to protect the site, the Templars soon began digging, quietly, for years. No construction projects, no recorded purpose, just digging. And then, just as quietly, they stopped. What were they searching for? Some believe it was the Ark of the Covenant. Others suggest scrolls, early lost rituals, sacred relics. But among the more persistent theories is this, that they found proof of the sacred bloodline. Not metaphor, but names, dates, genealogies, a buried truth linking Christ to descendants. A truth that would place the Merovingians at the center of a spiritual revolution, and the Church in a very uncomfortable position. Of course, there's no hard evidence of what they found, but there is a shift. After their return to Europe, the Templars became different. They grew in wealth and political influence. They began erecting cathedrals and chapels using architectural forms never before seen. Geometry steeped in sacred symbolism. Circles, pentagrams, black Madonnas. Some even claim the layout of certain Templar sites mirrors star constellations or Kabbalistic patterns. Their rituals became more opaque, their hierarchy more secretive. And then there's the curious case of their downfall. By the early 1300s, the Templars had grown too powerful. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to them, turned on the order. In 1307, on Friday the 13th, a date that would become ominous, they were arrested en masse, tortured, forced to confess to heresy, worship of strange idols, blasphemous rites, homosexuality, rituals involving a disembodied head. It all sounds too wild, too convenient, and yet under torture, many confessed to something. They spoke of knowledge too great for men, of a truth the Church feared. One even hinted at a bloodline, a line that stretches to the east and yet remains here with us. Were these just the ravings of broken men, or fragments of a secret too old to name? An obscure but well-documented fragment surfaces here, the Chignome parchment discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 2001. It reveals that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars of heresy before their executions. Why absolve them and then allow their destruction? Was it guilt or fear?
Another strange detail appears in the trial records, the repeated reference to a head, sometimes called Baphomet, sometimes the head of wisdom. Scholars argue endlessly about what this meant: an idol, a preserved relic, a symbol. But the most chilling theory is this, that it was not a mere object, but a relic of the bloodline, a literal head, maybe even the mummified remains of someone important, someone with a bloodline too sacred to destroy and too dangerous to reveal. It's here we circle back to the Merovingians. Some versions of the legend claim that the Templars weren't just defenders of pilgrims, but of a lineage, that their true mission, the reason for their secrecy and power, was the protection of descendants, those born of that ancient union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Sang Grail, the royal blood, and the name that appears most often in these whispers, Dagobah II. A few even believe that the Templars didn't lose their power. They simply transferred it into other groups, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, secret societies that inherited not just symbols, but the mission to guard the bloodline until the world was ready. Modern historians push back, of course. The evidence is scattered, circumstantial, and yet the pieces fit too snugly to dismiss out of hand. Why did the Templars guard the Temple Mount? Why did they dig in secret? Why did their rituals be cloaked in silence? Why did so many of them go willingly to death, never revealing what they truly served? It might be that the Templars were more than protectors. They may have been archivists, midwives of history, or perhaps usurpers. Because here's the darker twist. Some believe the Templars didn't merely guard the bloodline, they used it. That they may have appropriated its power, its legitimacy, its symbolism for themselves. That the true descendants were pushed aside, hidden, forgotten, while others cloaked themselves in borrowed divinity. After all, secrecy is a double-edged sword.
What's hidden can be protected, but it can also be stolen. And so the question stands, sharp as a blade in the dark. Were the Knights Templar the loyal defenders of a sacred truth, or cunning stewards of a legacy they claimed but never truly owned? You can almost hear the stone doors closing behind you, the echoes of steel boots, the rustle of a banner, and somewhere, just beneath the silence, the heartbeat of a secret still guarded by men who never speak. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a thread thin as silk, strong as fate, stretching from the hills of Galilee to the forests of Gaul. It winds through deserts, catacombs, cloisters, and coronations. It passes through wombs, through whispers, through wars. And at every point along its length, someone tries to cut it. But the thread remains, pulsing softly beneath the skin of history. This is the supposed bloodline of Jesus, carried not by gospel, but by genealogy. And if certain stories are true, it led directly to Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. Now that's a bold leap, and bold leaps deserve cautious steps. So let's walk carefully. First, the foundational claim that Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene were not only close companions, but husband and wife, that they had children, that those children, exiled or hidden after the crucifixion, eventually settled in what is now southern France. This idea, of course, exists far outside mainstream Christian teaching, but it's not a new invention. In fact, fragments of it can be found in early Gnostic texts, oral traditions of the Languedoc, and most provocatively, in the pages of the Gospel of Philip, a manuscript that refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus's koinos, a term richer than the bland translation, companion. In ancient Greek, it carries undertones of partnership, intimacy, even marriage. Modern scholars debate the implications. Was it metaphorical, literal, a linguistic artifact? No one agrees, which means the door, inconveniently, remains ajar. So let's assume, for the sake of exploration, that this bloodline existed. What happened to it? Some believe Mary Magdalene fled after the crucifixion, taking her unborn child with her. Legends persist, especially in Provence, that she arrived by boat with a small retinue, including Lazarus and Martha, and settled in the region of Sainte-Marie de la Mer. The region still venerates her. Shrines bear her name. Statues depict her with flowing red hair and a golden vessel, often mistaken for the Grail, but perhaps symbolic of something far more organic, something inherited. Her child or children formed the foundation of a new bloodline, carefully protected, quietly multiplied, and eventually merged with local nobility. By the time the Roman Empire was fracturing and Gaul was bracing for barbarian invasions, that blood had allegedly found its way into the lineage of the Merovingians. Enter Clovis I, a man both brutal and brilliant, a warlord who unified the Frankish tribes and converted to Christianity in a moment that would reshape Western Europe. His baptism in 496 AD is one of the cornerstones of Catholic historiography. But here's where things get interesting. Unlike other kings of the time, Clovis wasn't just converted. He was anointed with oil said to have descended from heaven, brought by a dove, stored in a vial known as the Saint Umpala. This story, strange and dramatic, set Clovis apart. It wasn't just an act of faith, it was a ritual of selection, a coronation marked not by human hands, but by divine appointment. Why him? Some whisper that Clovis was chosen not simply for his military prowess or willingness to bow to Rome, but because he carried something within him, something ancient, a whisper of the sacred thread. If the Merovingians descended from the line of Jesus, then Clovis was not merely a king. He was a bridge between the divine and the temporal, the merger of sword and spirit, the emis. Of course, mainstream history records no such link. Clovis was born the son of Childeric the Fern, a pagan Frankish king, and Basina, a Thuringian noblewoman. Their family tree is mapped well until you begin to notice gaps, missing years, vague maternal links. And then there are the symbols. Bees found in Childeric's tomb, golden, intricately crafted, lying beside his remains. Bees were sacred to the Merovingians, often seen as symbols of resurrection, eternal life, and royal legitimacy. Napoleon would later adopt them too, seeking to connect himself not to the Carolingians, but to something older, something with myth in its marrow.
The claim, then, is this. The bloodline from Jesus and Mary Magdalene did not vanish into legend. It flowed into the Merovingians, beginning with Meavec, made flesh through Clovis, and continued, however quietly, through their heirs. It was protected, obscured, but never extinguished. If true, that would mean the French monarchy, at least in its earliest form, was not just politically sanctioned, but divinely descended in a way that no other European dynasty could claim. And that is precisely why the idea is so dangerous. Because if this sacred descent is real, it challenges the authority of every church, every doctrine, every monarchy that claimed divine right without divine DNA. It shifts the conversation from salvation through faith to salvation through blood, from churches to chromosomes. It also invites one of the great scholarly debates: can genealogy ever confirm such a claim? Most historians scoff. The records simply don't go back far enough. DNA evidence is too thin, too untraceable across centuries. And yet there are gaps, cracks in the record. Families in the Languedoc with surprisingly ancient lineages, matching heraldic symbols and oral traditions of unusual origin. Some modern researchers, like those behind the controversial Holy Blood, Holy Grail, tried to trace these connections. They found names, places, patterns, many of which wove through Dagobert II, Sigisbert IV, the Plantard family, Blaunfort, Gisors, Rennes-le-Château. Names that keep reappearing like musical notes in a fugue that's playing beneath the melody of history. Skeptics say it's wishful thinking, pattern recognition gone rogue. But maybe, just maybe, it's not about proof. Maybe it's about continuity, about the way a story once whispered finds its way into bone and blood, surviving long after the empire's fall and the saints are forgotten. Because what would you do if you discovered your family descended not from warlords or peasants, but from a man who walked on water and the woman who stood at the cross? Would you hide it, protect it, build an entire dynasty around it? Or would you bury it so deep that even history wouldn't find it? The word alone, grail, summons images. A glittering chalice, a knight kneeling in mist, a glowing cup held aloft in a beam of sunlight, perhaps in Arthurian forest or at the edge of some enchanted chapel. It's a symbol embedded so deeply in our cultural imagination that we rarely question it. The Grail is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, a sacred object of untold power. Except, what if it isn't? What if the Grail was never a cup? What if it was a person? The reimagining of the Holy Grail as Sang Grail, not Sang Grail, the Holy Grail, but Sang Grail, the royal blood, isn't just a linguistic trick. It's a conceptual rupture, a redirection of centuries of myth, shifting focus from relic to inheritance, from vessel to lineage. And at the core of this theory is a breathtaking claim that the Grail represents not the cup that held Christ's blood, but the bloodline itself, alive, hidden, and passed down through generations. Let's trace the origin of the idea. The earliest Grail stories don't mention Christ's cup. The 12th century writings of Chrétien de Troyes, generally considered the beginning of the Grail legend, describe a mysterious procession involving a golden Grail, but offer no explanation of what it is. Only later, through authors like Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Aschenbach, did the cup become explicitly linked to Christian relics. Even then, the details shift. Sometimes it's the cup of the Last Supper. Sometimes it catches Christ's blood at the cross. Sometimes it grants immortality, sometimes healing, sometimes nothing at all. The variability itself is suspicious. The Grail never had a fixed identity. It was a cipher, a symbol, waiting to be filled with meaning. So why not this meaning? Why not a bloodline? Those who subscribe to the bloodline theory point out that most Grail stories center not on finding the cup, but on understanding it. Grail quests are inward journeys.
The knight doesn't just stumble upon the object, he must be worthy of it. Often only those of pure heart or noble lineage can even approach the Grail, let alone comprehend its mystery. This has led some to suggest that the Grail is less an object, more a truth, an occult truth encoded into the fabric of dynastic succession.
And perhaps most compellingly, the earliest Grail romances were often written in the same regions associated with Merovingian legends, southern France, Languedoc, Occitania, precisely where stories of Mary Magdalene's exile and the Bloodline's survival also took root. Coincidence? Possibly. But coincidences, like riddles, tend to multiply when ignored. Now consider this. In several early Grail texts, the Grail bearer is a woman. In parts of all, she's called Repay, a name suspiciously similar to she who dispenses joy. She doesn't wield a sword. She doesn't rule a kingdom. She carries. She preserves. In a few versions, she's even pregnant, a symbolic mother. Could the Grail in these stories be a code? Could the bearer of the Grail be the protector of the bloodline? A Magdalene figure in literary disguise? The idea gathered momentum in modern times, thanks in part to the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which proposed that the Grail tradition was a cover story, a poetic myth built to preserve dangerous truths, that the stories of Pearl, Lancelot, and Galahad were symbolic echoes of an underground tradition designed to protect the line of descent from Christ. Again, traditional scholars reject this notion as speculative, but their arguments often hinge on the absence of direct proof, not the implausibility of the claim. And as we've seen, absence is not evidence of nothing. Sometimes it's the most curious evidence of all. If you dig deeper into symbolism, the shift becomes even more compelling. The cup in alchemical and mystical traditions is the feminine principle, the vessel, the womb. To reinterpret the Grail as Mary Magdalene, or more precisely, as the sacred womb that bore Christ's child, is not only consistent with ancient symbology, it unlocks layers of coherence in the myth. In this light, the quest for the Grail becomes something much more intimate, more heretical. It's not a hunt for a relic. It's a search for origin, for continuity, for the truth of inheritance. And suddenly, the Church's uneasy relationship with Mary Magdalene makes far more sense. For centuries, Mary Magdalene was slandered, rebranded as a prostitute despite no biblical basis. Her role in the resurrection narratives, her close relationship to Jesus, her importance among the disciples, all of it was minimized or distorted. But why? Why would the early Church go to such lengths to diminish a woman so clearly central to Christ's ministry? Unless, of course, she represented something dangerous. Not just spiritual insight, but blood. Not just love, but lineage. The shift from chalice to child also reframes the myth of the lost Grail. If the Grail is a bloodline, then it cannot be found in a vault, a cave, or a hidden chapel. It lives in people, in families, in descendants. It explains why so many Grail tales end not with triumphant discovery, but with ambiguous departure. The Grail disappears. It is taken away, or it is revealed only to vanish again, as if to say, you cannot possess it. You must be born from it. And perhaps most chilling of all, if the Church knew this, they had every reason to bury it. A relic can be enshrined, a doctrine can be debated, but a bloodline, a living human being who embodies a truth that undermines the entire theology of divine mystery,
That's not a theological inconvenience. That's a revolution waiting to happen. So, here we are. Centuries of myth, dozens of versions, and at the center, a cup that may not be a cup at all. A grail that is not chased through forests, but chased through family trees. And maybe, just maybe, that thread we imagined earlier, the one stretching from Galilee to Gaul, it's not fiction. It's DNA. You find yourself high in the foothills of the Pyrenees, where the wind moves like a whisper between olive trees and forgotten secrets. Nestled in this quiet corner of southern France is a village so small you might miss it on a map. And yet it guards one of the strangest and most enduring enigmas of modern European history, Rennes-le-Château, a place where fact and fiction refuse to be separated. And at the heart of it all stands a single man, Bérenger Saunière, the 19th century priest who, if the stories are to be believed, discovered something so explosive it threatened the foundation of the church itself. He was assigned to the village in 1885. The chapel was dilapidated, the congregation poor, the presbytery barely habitable. By all logic, Saunière should have lived out his years in obscurity, scraping together sermons and tending to a handful of peasants.
But then something changed. It began with the renovation. Saunière started repairing the church of St. Mary Magdalene. He ordered custom statues, lavish stained glass, a bizarre altar oddly decorated with demons, skulls, and cryptic phrases. Latin inscriptions that read, "By this sign you will conquer," and "Terrible is this place." Curious language for a village chapel, wouldn't you say? And then came the spending. The once impoverished priest suddenly had funds, not a little, a lot. He built a tower, the Tour Magdala, to house his personal library. He constructed a lavish estate, filled it with rare books, antiques, and guests. He entertained scholars, nobles, even spies. And when asked where the money came from, he waved it away as donations. But local records tell a different story. There were no large tithes, no generous patrons. His wealth appeared quite literally from nowhere. According to one version of the tale, during the renovation of the church, Saunière found a set of parchments hidden inside a hollowed-out pillar of the altar. The parchments were said to contain strange genealogies, references to a hidden bloodline, and messages encrypted with layers of ciphers. Some claimed they included the name Dagobert II. Others pointed to the Priory of Sion. Whether these documents ever truly existed remains a matter of debate. But what did exist was Saunière's sudden and inexplicable access to extraordinary resources. He made frequent trips to Paris, where he consulted with members of the occult elite. He visited the Church of Saint-Sulpice, known for its ties to esoteric Catholicism. He returned with rare books on alchemy, ancient symbols, and sacred geometry. And perhaps most oddly, he spent large amounts of money, not just on his estate, but to keep others away. He purchased nearby land simply to ensure no one else could dig there. One story tells of a map, a coded diagram left behind in the margins of a book Saunière owned. It depicted the region around Rennes-le-Château, marked with peculiar symbols, crosses, stars, triangles. When laid over the local geography, these marks aligned with old Templar sites and megalithic structures. The suggestion, a hidden chamber, a tomb,
perhaps even the final resting place of Mary Magdalene herself, or the records proving her descendants survived. It sounds fantastical, but then again, so does a poor priest who becomes a secret millionaire without explanation. And Saunier wasn't subtle. His chapel became a surreal fusion of piety and paranoia. The Stations of the Cross he commissioned include visual anomalies, figures staring directly at the viewer, inverted symbology, secret hand signs. Some believe the layout of the church itself encodes a message, a map, or a warning, a riddle in marble and wood meant for eyes trained to read between the lines. And then, just as suddenly as it began, his fortune ended. The church launched an investigation into his finances, threatening excommunication. But Saunier refused to reveal the source of his wealth. He claimed it came from masses he performed on behalf of the dead, thousands of them, in fact, often in a single day, a bureaucratic impassibility. Still, it was the only excuse he ever offered. In his final years, Saunier became reclusive. He refused the sacraments. He hoarded letters and notebooks. And when he suffered a stroke in 1917, his confession was heard by a priest who emerged visibly shaken. He allegedly refused to grant Saunier absolution. What, one wonders, did he hear? Upon his death, her servant and close companion, Marie Leonardo, inherited everything. She refused all offers to buy the estate. Some say she'd been waiting for the right buyer. Others believe she'd taken a vow to protect a secret. On her deathbed, she reportedly whispered, "The secret is so big, people would never believe it." Which brings us to the obscurity that still haunts Rennes-le-Château. Was Saunier simply a fraud, a clever forger who exploited the church and invented a mystique to mask his schemes? Or did he truly discover something buried beneath the church, beneath the altar, beneath centuries of silence? And if so, what was it? A treasure, a scroll, a genealogy, a corpse? Skeptics dismiss the story as myth-making. They point to the lack of hard evidence, the absence of surviving documents, the exaggerations of 20th century authors. But curiously, the church has never fully explained its own response to Saunier.
Why were his crimes never prosecuted formally? Why, after his death, did several ecclesiastical authorities quietly visit the village? Why was the church so eager to close the file? Perhaps because the secret wasn't his to reveal. Or perhaps because he never revealed it at all. Maybe it's still there beneath the stones, waiting. Maybe that's why people still come here. Artists, scholars, pilgrims. Not for the view, not for the chapel, but for the feeling. That quiet nudge behind your ribs when you step into the nave. That sense that the air is holding its breath, that the walls know something, that the Grail was never far away, that it was never a cup. It was a name. Now we step into quieter corridors, places where words vanish and silence is scripted. Imagine the Vatican not as a grand cathedral, but as a labyrinth of filing rooms, sealed drawers, and keys known only to a few. Beneath its polished floors and sanctified halls lies one of the most secure archives in the world. Millions of documents dating back over 1,000 years. Most are mundane, some are heretical, and a few, just a few, are not even catalogued. This is where the Bloodline story begins to fade from public record. Not with fire, but with forgetfulness. not with scandal, but with erasure. You see, the Church is expert in managing memory. It doesn't always destroy ideas, it buries them, redirects attention, reframes narratives. And the Merovingians, with their inconvenient divine claims and their dangerous proximity to Gnostic theology, posed a perfect target. Let's go back for a moment. The Merovingians were once considered divinely chosen, not just by their people, but by elements within the Church itself. Bishops anointed them, saints praised them. Yet by the time of Pepin the Short's rise in 751, that relationship had soured. The Pope granted Pepin the crown of the Franks, officially ending Merovingian rule and beginning the Carolingian dynasty. But curiously, this transition happened without war, without rebellion. The Merovingians were quietly brushed aside, as if their entire lineage had served its purpose and was no longer needed. That should raise eyebrows. A ruling dynasty doesn't simply vanish from history without resistance unless the erasure is mutually beneficial. Some suggest the Church struck a bargain. Remove the bloodline in exchange for Carolingian compliance, and the first act of compliance, erase all reference to the Merovingians' divine lineage. Redefine their mysticism as paganism, rebrand their sacred rituals as superstitions, dismiss their symbols as meaningless ornaments, and most effectively, stop talking about them entirely. This brings us to one very well-established fact. After the Carolingian rise, Church-approved chronicles largely ceased mentioning the Merovingians at all. No formal condemnation, no debate, just absence, as though history had quietly inhaled and chosen never to exhale. Then comes the obscure detail, rarely discussed, barely acknowledged. In 1244, during the Albigensian Crusade, a set of heretical documents was allegedly seized from the Cathars at Montmassur. These texts, believed to have been hidden in the Pyrenees for centuries, reportedly included genealogical charts, apocryphal gospels, and something referred to cryptically as linea sacra regalis, the sacred royal line. The documents were taken to the Vatican, where they vanished. No inventory, no published reference, nothing. But here's where it gets stranger. In the 17th century, the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kerker, known for his work on ancient texts and secret alphabets, made a brief, puzzling note in one of his letters. He described a forbidden manuscript in the Vatican's possession, sealed in a copper box, written in a mix of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He referred to it not by title, but as sangue veritatis, the blood of truth. He said it undermines the foundations of dogma with lineage and names too ancient to refute. He never mentioned it again. Most believed this was metaphor. Kerker was known for his poetic exaggerations. But if it was real, if such a document did exist, it could explain the Vatican's obsessive control over access to certain archives. Only a handful of people are allowed into the Vatican's secret archives each year, and even then, they must know exactly what they're looking for. You can't simply browse. There's no casual discovery, no shelf labeled Secret Bloodlines, Aisle 12. It's a system designed to prevent unexpected revelations, to protect the past from the present.
Which brings us to the ongoing scholarly debate. Is the Vatican hiding evidence of the Merovingian bloodline? Many historians would scoff. The archives are vast, yes, but carefully maintained. And yet we must remember this. The Church has redacted before. Doctrines have been shaped, Gospels excluded, saints erased. The Council of Nicaea omitted entire traditions. The Inquisition burned libraries. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls were initially withheld from the public for decades, controlled by a select group of scholars handpicked by the Church. So suppression is not just possible, it's precedent. And what about the peculiar case of the Gospel of Mary, discovered in the 19th century? This Gnostic text, long buried in the sands of Egypt, paints Mary Magdalene not as a footnote, but as a teacher, a confidant, perhaps even the true heir to Christ's wisdom. Why was this gospel never included in the canon? Why was it buried for so long? Because it suggested continuity, a legacy, not from Peter, but from Magdalene. Now connect that to the Merovingian claim. A bloodline from Mary Magdalene, protected by noble families, suppressed by the Church. It starts to fit, doesn't it? There's one more piece. In 1957, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni gave an interview, his only recorded public statement. When asked about the missing years of Merovingian records, he replied cryptically, "Some truths are not lost. They are withheld to protect what should never be questioned." That's all he said. And perhaps that's the most telling silence of all. Because erasure doesn't always look like flames. Sometimes it looks like preservation, like reverent silence, like rooms with no windows, like drawers with no labels. And somewhere, perhaps in the Vatican's endless hush, sits a box, locked, untouched, waiting for no one. Let your eyes adjust to the warm candlelight of an old studio. Dust glinting in sunbeams, the scent of linseed oil thick in the air. Canvases lean against every surface, half-finished masterpieces scattered like silent conspirators. And there, hunched over a slab of wood, his gaze a mixture of divine mischief and mathematical focus, sits Leonardo da Vinci, polymath, inventor, anatomist, and, if some theories are to be believed, secret keeper of the Merovingian bloodline. We've reached one of the most controversial links in this tangled web, the idea that Leonardo embedded secrets about the Merovingian lineage and the Holy Bloodline into his paintings, most famously in The Last Supper. Let's start with what everyone knows. The Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498 in a refectory of the convent of Santa Maria dell'Agate in Milan, depicts Jesus and the 12 apostles at the moment he announces that one of them will betray him. The composition is perfect, balanced, emotional, yet oddly still. But it's not what's there that triggers suspicion. It's who. To the right of Jesus, our left, sits a youthful, delicate figure with flowing auburn hair and soft features. Traditionally, this is labeled John the Apostle, but for centuries, artists and scholars alike have noted the unmistakably feminine appearance. High cheekbones, tilted head, no beard, a coy angle of the wrist and hands, clasped not in fear, but serenity. Could this be Mary Magdalene? It's a question that erupted into mainstream conversation thanks to the Da Vinci Code. But the speculation didn't begin with Dan Brown. Earlier, theorists had already noted the feminine form,
the V-shaped space between Jesus and this figure forming a distinct chalice-like shape. A grail, if you will. The suggestion being Mary Magdalene is not just present, she is central, not only beside Jesus, but part of a symbolic union, equal, intimate, essential. Leonardo never labeled his figures, but he also didn't do anything without intent. Consider his obsession with symmetry, with proportion, with sacred geometry. The entire painting pulses with hidden structure. Lines converge, angles create triangles, negative space carries as much weight as form. It is, by all accounts, a visual code. And here's where it gets stranger. In 2003, computer analysis of the Last Supper revealed that if you mirror the painting, placing a reversed copy beside the original, a peculiar pattern emerges. Certain gestures align, gazes match, a subtle star shape appears at the center. It may be coincidence, or it may be a carefully embedded duality, male and female, reflection and origin, Christ and Magdalene. Leonardo was known to embed musical scales into paintings.
He wrote in mirrored script. He used anatomical dissections as metaphors for spiritual questions. He was not just painting theology, he was encrypting it. And then there's the Virgin of the Rocks, another of his masterpieces. There are two versions of this painting, one housed in the Louvre, the other in the National Gallery in London. Both depict the Virgin Mary, the infant Jesus, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel. But there are inconsistencies. In one, Mary's hand hovers over a child's head in a protective, almost priestly gesture. In the other, her expression shifts slightly, more enigmatic. In both, the rocky cave setting feels symbolic, almost womb-like, the light filtering in like divine awareness. Some see in these two paintings the echo of duality. Again, two versions of the same truth, one overt, one obscured. And if you follow this thread further, you'll find that many of Da Vinci's paintings contain odd anatomical features, hidden hearts, vessels, and in one case, what appears to be the outline of a fetus embedded in drapery. Symbolism, always, but of what? Leonardo belonged to several secret circles. He was closely associated with members of the Sforza family, known patrons of esoteric study. He also illustrated the Codex Atlanticus, a collection that included diagrams of strange flying machines, but also sacred maps, astrological references, and symbols found in early Templar manuscripts. Which leads us to the core of the claim that Leonardo da Vinci was not merely a painter, but a custodian, not of the Church's doctrine, but of its counter-narrative. The idea that the Holy Grail was a bloodline, that the Church's authority had suppressed the feminine aspect of the divine, that Mary Magdalene, not Peter, was the rightful heir to Christ's teachings, and that her descendants, perhaps the Merovingians, were the living Grail. This idea, of course, infuriates traditional scholars. They point to the lack of primary evidence, the inconsistency of interpretations, the way our brains love to find patterns where none were intended. All valid critiques. But consider the timing. Leonardo painted the Last Supper during an era when heresy meant death. He could not have simply stated these ideas outright, but hiding them, that's a different matter. And when you remember that his patrons were often political enemies of Rome, the motivation becomes clearer. Could he have embedded a secret, one preserved through visual language, passed down like a riddle to those with eyes to see? And if so, who was meant to decode it?
Which brings us to an open question that scholars still debate today. Did Leonardo da Vinci believe in the bloodline myth? Or did he merely find the symbolism compelling? Was he transmitting a truth he had learned, or shaping a narrative of his own? Some suggest that he never made a distinction, that he saw art, science, religion, and mystery as interconnected veins in the same body. And if truth resided anywhere, it was in patterns, not in sermons, but in symmetry. What we can say is this: Leonardo da Vinci left behind no children, no personal memoir, and no overt theology. What he left instead was a body of work that resists simplicity, that glows with questions. A man obsessed with anatomy who painted hearts into halos. A man who understood blood and perhaps its legacy. So the next time you look at the Last Supper, let your eyes soften. See not a cup, but a space. Not 12 men and one Messiah, but a pair, a symmetry, a secret. And in that negative space between them, where no hand touches, and yet everything connects, you might just find the shape of the Grail. Now imagine history, not as a sequence of events, but as a stage. Curtains rise and fall, costumes change, the actors rotate, but behind the scenes, the script is rewritten in candlelit rooms by men whose names are rarely remembered, only their decisions. And one of the boldest rewrites in European history was the quiet replacement of a mystical dynasty with a manufactured one. The Merovingians erased, the Carolingians installed, and a sacred bloodline forcibly traded for a more obedient brand of king. Let's set the scene. The year is 751. The Frankish kingdom is large but fraying. The Merovingian monarch, Childeric III, sits on the throne in name only. His hair, once the source of royal power, is long but meaningless. Real authority lies with Pepin, the short mayor of the palace, a role originally designed to manage court affairs, but now more powerful than the king himself.
Pepin is a man of action, strategic, charismatic, and, importantly, connected to Rome. According to Frankish annals, Pepin sent envoys to Pope Zachary with a bold question. Should the one who holds the power be the king? The Pope, facing threats from the Lombards and in desperate need of a strong ally, responded with a subtle nod. Yes, the throne should be held by the one who rules. The message was clear. So Childeric III was deposed, not assassinated, not exiled, simply sent to a monastery, his sacred hair shorn, his power nullified by scissors and silence. And in his place, Pepin was crowned, not by local bishops, but by the Pope himself. The ceremony was an act of choreography, sacred oil, chants, oaths. In that moment, the Carolingian dynasty was born, and with it a new alignment between church and crown. But here's where things become curiously deliberate. The Carolingians didn't just replace the Merovingians, they rewrote them. Chronicles were redrafted, genealogies questioned. Merovingian kings who had once been praised for miracles and visions were suddenly painted as ineffective, lazy, or corrupt. The narrative shifted, as if a stagehand had pulled the lever and flipped the backdrop. There's a well-established fact buried here, and it's easy to overlook because it feels so mundane. There was no war, no civil unrest, no public outrage. A 1,000-year-old dynasty was dissolved with barely a ripple. That kind of quiet suggests preparation, agreement, or manipulation. This brings us to the obscure interpretation that the Merovingian fall was not a natural political evolution, but a carefully orchestrated cover-up.
that Pepin and the Church didn't just want a new king, they wanted to erase a threat. The Merovingians, with their claims of divine blood and mystical authority, were too unruly, too independent. They didn't need the Pope to justify their rule. Their legitimacy came from birth, from myth, from sacred origin. And if that origin was tied to Christ himself, the implications were catastrophic for church hierarchy. Consider this. The Church's authority is built on spiritual succession. Apostles, bishops, popes, each step sanctioned by the last, a sacred line of authority. But the Merovingians represented something else, a line of inheritance, sacred by blood, not by office, a contradiction to the very bones of Catholic structure. So the Church made a trade, apostolic succession in exchange for genealogical silence, and the Carolingians were happy to oblige. Pepin the Short was a practical man, his son Charlemagne even more so. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian court became a center of Christian reform and imperial theology. The Bible was standardized, heresies were rooted out, and crucially, church and state fused in a way that elevated clerical power to unprecedented heights. But among these reforms came a peculiar absence, the systematic downplaying of the Merovingian past. Saints, once celebrated, fell into obscurity. Monasteries tied to Merovingian patronage were disbanded or restructured. Even burial sites were quietly neglected. The Merovingians didn't just die out, they were archived. And yet some traces slipped through. In the Liber Historiae Francorum, an early 8th century chronicle, the Merovingians are described as from ancient stock chosen by God. Later editions of the same text, produced under Carolingian oversight, omit this phrasing entirely. Likewise, the once venerated Saint Dagobert II, whose cult flourished briefly in eastern France, was quietly desainted, not condemned, just forgotten. This soft erasure raises a haunting question. If the Merovingians were just weak kings, why go to such lengths to delete them? The answer may lie in fear, not of politics, but of symbolism. Imagine a living descendant of Christ walking the halls of Europe, claiming no throne perhaps, but still bearing the right. That right would challenge every pope, every bishop, every dogma crafted over centuries. It would turn theology into genealogy and faith into DNA. Which is why some argue the Carolingian coup wasn't about replacing a dynasty, it was about replacing a myth. The myth of sacred blood, the idea that divine power could be inherited. But myths don't die easily. There are legends, scattered, whispering that Sigisbert IV, son of Dagobert II, escaped the assassination of his father and fled south, that he lived under protection in the region of Septimania, that his descendants quietly married into noble families, that their blood never died, only diluted and hidden.
In this version of history, the Carolingians are caretakers, stand-ins, and the real royal line, the line of Christ, continued in silence, far from thrones and papal crowns. The scholarly debate rages. Many dismiss these ideas as speculative fiction, but a growing minority of researchers are asking uncomfortable questions about the gaps, the redactions, the quiet transfer of power that happened without resistance. Because in the end, it's not about whether the Carolingians were good rulers. It's about why the Merovingians had to disappear so thoroughly. What were they protecting? Or, more unsettlingly, who? Because behind every political shift, every royal anointing, every theological decree, there is a story too dangerous to tell directly. One that must be hidden not in fire, but in forgetting. And sometimes that forgetting is too perfect. Step back for a moment and look around. Not at cathedrals or crypts, but at the symbols that surround you. On coats of arms, on rings, in church windows, in the folds of royal robes. We live among signs, patterns, emblems that linger long after memory fades. And when it comes to the Merovingians, their greatest secret may not have been buried at all, but carved, woven, and etched into the world in plain sight. The most iconic of these is the bee. Yes, the bee. To most, it's just an industrious little insect, harmless, honey-making, a pleasant metaphor for work and order. But to the Merovingians, the bee was something far more sacred. It represented immortality, resurrection, and divine kingship. Golden bees crafted with care and intention were found in the tomb of Childeric, the fern-father of Clovis. Over 300 of them, resting like tiny guards around his body, each one exquisitely designed. They weren't ornamental, they were messages, a statement that this was no ordinary king. This was a being of eternal rule, marked by something holy. The bee in ancient symbology was often associated with the soul. The Egyptians believed bees carried messages between the mortal and divine realms. The Greeks linked bees to the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestesses, the Melissae, literally bees channeled divine insight. That the Merovingians chose this creature as their symbol suggests they saw themselves not merely as rulers of land, but as intermediaries, sacred monarchs in touch with something eternal. Now trace this symbol forward. After the Carolingians erased the Merovingians, the bee vanished for centuries. It lay dormant. But in 1804, during his coronation as Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, he resurrected it. He ordered golden bees stitched into his coronation robe. His banners bore them. His imperial emblems swarmed with them. He bypassed the fleur-de-lis of the French Bourbons, the traditional post-Carolingian symbol of monarchy, and reached back, consciously or not, to the older line, the first kings of France. Some say Napoleon did it deliberately, that he saw himself as the rightful heir to the sacred line. Others believe he stumbled upon the bee in an archaeological report and thought it looked regal. Either way, the result was the same. The bee returned, and with it, a whisper of the line it once represented. And the bees are just the beginning. Take the fleur-de-lis. You probably know it. 3 petals elegantly flared. A classic French emblem seen on flags, shields, royal seals. But there's an alternate reading, one that ties it not to a flower, but to lineage. The 3-pronged shape has been interpreted by some esoteric historians as representing the Holy Family, father, mother, and child, a trinity of blood, of a symbol not of piety, but of birthright. And in some medieval depictions, the fleur-de-lis is subtly feminine. Its curves mirror the female reproductive form, a hidden homage, perhaps, to the Magdalene, to the vessel, to the Grail, not as object, but as origin. Even Merovingian coins bore strange sigils, stars with 7 points, knots without ends, inverted crosses that in later centuries would be misread as signs of evil. But to the Merovingians, these were sacred. The 7-pointed star, for example, was not a sign of darkness,
but of divine perfection. It represented the union of spiritual and earthly power, a subtle declaration: we are of this world, and yet not bound by it. Churches, too, carry the echoes. In certain abbeys with Merovingian roots, architectural anomalies remain: tiled floors and spiral patterns, pillars placed in mathematically precise ratios,
chapels with Magdalene dedications that predate her formal veneration by centuries. And hidden in fresco and mosaics, you'll sometimes find the bee again. Tiny, almost invisible, hovering near the foot of a saint or in the corner of a tapestry. Silent witnesses, coded custodians of something left unspoken. Modern heraldry and corporate logos have even been pulled into the conversation, albeit controversially. Some researchers claim that modern secret societies, especially those with supposed roots in Templar or Masonic traditions, adopted Merovingian symbology into their crests: patterns of 3, spirals, bees. It is difficult to ignore the recurrence of these motifs in places that claim no direct connection to the dynasty and yet carry its marks like fingerprints. And here's where things get more unnerving. If you begin to look for these symbols not as ornaments, but as language, you'll find them more often than you'd expect. Not because the Merovingians planted them everywhere, but because their legacy was absorbed, repurposed, and echoed like a melody heard faintly in the background of 100 different songs. It's always there, not dominant, but constant. Take the layout of certain European cities, Paris, for example. There are theories, dismissed by many, but not all, that parts of the city's ancient design mimic sacred geometry. Lines drawn from old Merovingian strongholds to forgotten tombs create shapes: hexagons, pentacles, vesica pieces. Mere coincidence, perhaps. But then why do the same patterns appear in parts of Rennes-le-Château, Chartres, even as far away as Edinburgh? That's the open question. Are these patterns proof of a preserved code, or are they simply humanity's tendency to project meaning onto chaos? Either way, the symbols remain, and their persistence is in itself a kind of evidence. Because in a world where words are rewritten and records redacted, symbols endure. They outlast persecution. They bypass doctrine. They sit quietly in stained glass, waiting for someone to notice, someone like you. And maybe that's the final trick of the Merovingians. They didn't vanish. They adapted. Their name may have faded, their tombs hidden, their blood diluted. But their stories survived, woven into glyphs, stitched into robes, carved into archways no one thinks to question. So next time you see a bee in a crest or a fleur-de-lis above a church door, ask yourself, is it just decoration, or is it a message? The wind shifts softly along the southern coast of France, carrying with it the scent of salt and lavender. Along the rocky shoreline of the Camargue, waves lap gently against the boats moored in the harbor of a small, unassuming village, Sainte Marie de la Mer. It's quiet here, peaceful. But if the old stories are to be believed, this is sacred ground, the place where a boat without sails, rudder, or crew once drifted ashore, bearing within it the woman who had once stood at the foot of the cross, Mary Magdalene. In Christian canon, her
Her story ends abruptly. She is present at the crucifixion. She is the first to witness the resurrection, and then nothing. Her name vanishes from the New Testament narrative like a breath caught in the throat. No mention of her travels, no record of her death, only silence. But tradition, especially here in France, whispers a different tale. For centuries, the people of Provence have believed that Mary Magdalene did not vanish. She fled. That she, along with a small group of followers, possibly including Martha, Lazarus, Maximus, and even Joseph of Arimathea, escaped persecution in the Holy Land and journeyed across the sea. Their destination, the wild coast of Gaul, a place far from Rome's reach, where memory could linger unchallenged. This story has endured for over 1,000 years, long before the bloodline theory caught fire in modern conspiracy circles. Pilgrims came to St. Mary de la Mer to venerate not just one Mary, but three: Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, and Mary Jacobi. These three Marys, according to local legend, arrived by miracle and brought with them the earliest flame of Christianity in Europe. Their presence is honored annually in a festival that merges Catholic reverence with something far older, almost pagan. Candles floating on water, chants rising over firelit sands. The Romany people dancing in devotion to Saint Sarah, the so-called Black Madonna, said to have arrived with the trio. It's easy to dismiss such traditions as folklore, but they have left tangible traces. In the nearby town of Saint-Maximin, La Sainte-Baume, a massive basilica holds what are believed to be the bones of Mary Magdalene herself.
Discovered in the 13th century by monks, her skull is encased in a golden reliquary, her long red hair still clinging to the bone. They say DNA testing has never been allowed, but the relics have been authenticated by the church. And if you stand in that crypt, surrounded by the hush of stone and centuries, you might feel something beneath the official story, a kind of tension, like a truth left just barely unsaid. And then there's Le Château, the holy cave in the Provençal mountains, a pilgrimage site since at least the 5th century. It's said to be the place where Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplative seclusion. Her tears, they say, hollowed the cave's walls. Her prayers sanctified the air. And to this day, the cave draws pilgrims who walk the long trail through the forest, often barefoot, in reverence. Why would such legends endure for so long, in so many forms, across so many centuries, if they held no root? Skeptics point to the late timing of these stories, suggesting they were medieval inventions, romantic tales meant to inspire pilgrimage and boost local economies. That's certainly possible. But some details resist that easy dismissal. For instance, certain Merovingian-era chapels in southern France were dedicated to Magdalene centuries before the church officially elevated her status. Frescoes from as early as the 6th century show her not as a penitent sinner, but as a regal figure, dressed in blue, holding a vessel, often standing beside a child. Why would these depictions predate formal doctrine by hundreds of years? And why in these same regions do genealogies surface, preserved by noble families, that claim descent not from kings or emperors, but from her? This brings us to the controversial claim at the heart of the bloodline theory, that Mary Magdalene arrived in France not alone, but pregnant, that the child she carried was the direct descendant of Jesus, that the family she founded merged into the fabric of southern nobility, quietly, reverently, and with strategic care.
Over time, they became protectors of Gnostic traditions, keepers of sacred knowledge, and perhaps even the genetic source of the Merovingian dynasty itself. Mainstream historians balk. There's no proof, they say, no written record. But again, the absence itself feels too neat. Why no tomb in the Holy Land? Why no mention of her fate by early church fathers who obsessed over the lives of saints and martyrs? Why the sudden silence after the resurrection? Perhaps because her story had shifted from scripture to secrecy, from gospel to blood. The Magdalene cult, as some scholars refer to it, was suppressed for centuries. By the Middle Ages, she had been transformed into a repentant prostitute, a narrative with no scriptural basis, yet one that served to diminish her authority and erase any claims she might hold as a spiritual equal or maternal figure. And yet, even under the weight of official doctrine, she endured. She became the patroness of perfume makers, of contemplatives, of the misunderstood. Her image shifted but never vanished. She reappeared in paintings, often cloaked in red or green, holding her alabaster jar. And in more esoteric works, she was shown with a book, a scroll, a child, symbols that suggest she carried more than just grief. She carried inheritance. To this day, some small villages in the south of France claim Magdalene as their ancestral mother. Families tell stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter, stories never written down, stories of a red-haired woman with a gentle voice, of a boy with her eyes, of a legacy protected not with swords, but with silence. It is memory wrapped in myth, or myth wrapped in memory. Either way, it lives. So, was Mary Magdalene just a disciple, a saint, a symbol of repentance? Or was she something more? A mother? A matriarch? A living grail? And if so, her blood didn't end in Galilee. It flowered in the hills of France, and perhaps still flows today. You're walking through a crumbling stone corridor now, torchlight flickering across moss-covered walls. The air is cool, damp, and thick with the scent of age, like earth and metal deep underground. You're beneath Temple Mount, beneath a forgotten priory, or perhaps beneath your own imagination, depending on whom you ask. But here in these ancient shadows, one legend has endured above all others: the Templar treasure. A hoard said to contain relics, scrolls, gold beyond counting, and perhaps something far more dangerous, a secret capable of rewriting the story of Christianity itself.
The idea of a lost treasure isn't just a romantic fantasy. It's rooted in multiple historical facts. When the Knights Templar were arrested en masse in 1307, King Philip IV of France expected to find their riches easily seized. He had spies, he had maps, he had accountants ready to count coins. But when his men raided the Paris Temple, the order's grand headquarters, they found almost nothing. No gold, no scrolls, no relics. The vaults were empty. This absence ignited centuries of speculation. Had the Templars moved their treasures in advance? Did they know the arrest was coming? Or had it never been stored there at all? The most persistent theory is that the Templars had long before smuggled their greatest secrets, possibly from Jerusalem, possibly from the Temple of Solomon itself, back to Europe. That these items were hidden in a series of underground locations, protected by layers of encoded maps, cryptic tomb engravings, and signs only initiates could interpret. And among these whispered relics wasn't merely gold, it was a gospel, a genealogy, a truth so destabilizing that the church and monarchy alike had every reason to keep it buried. Let's rewind. During their time in Jerusalem, the Templars weren't just military escorts. They spent nearly a decade digging beneath the Temple Mount under the pretext of renovating quarters. Some accounts suggest they discovered ancient artifacts, scrolls written in languages lost to time, objects made of unknown alloys, and perhaps even sacred remains. One of the most repeated claims is that they uncovered documentation of the Holy Bloodline, lineage charts, secret gospels, proof that Jesus had a wife, a child, and that this family line had survived. These relics weren't simply religious, they were political weapons, evidence that could overturn centuries of doctrine, perhaps even shift the locus of divine authority from Rome to wherever those descendants still lived. The legend of the treasure follows a path through France. Some believe it was transported to Rennes-le-Château, the very village where Bon Saunier made his fortune after supposedly discovering coded parchments. Others believe it was moved to Cathar, where its secret tunnels and hollowed trees still echo with tales of buried chests. A third theory ties it to the Château de Blanchefort, where geometric anomalies in the surrounding landscape align with constellations, suggesting a celestial map, a coded burial site. But wherever it was taken, one thing is certain: it was never found, or perhaps never allowed to be. What if the treasure was more conceptual than material? What if the gold was symbolic, a metaphor for sacred knowledge? If that knowledge involved the Merovingian bloodline, descendants of Christ himself, then the implications would dwarf any material gain. Now, let's address a curious obscurity. In 1952, a document known as the Parchment of Blanchefort was discovered, supposedly referencing the treasure of the Templars hidden beneath a mound of peace, or mon pivu. Embedded in the Latin text were curious phrases and codes, acrostics, reversed letters and numbers that matched no known system. One phrase stood out: "The guardian will sleep no more." Who or what was the guardian? Some interpreted it as a living descendant. Others saw it as a metaphor for a revived society. Perhaps the Prior de Sion, charged with keeping the bloodline safe. Another fascinating clue lies in the tale of Arnaud de Ville, a 14th century alchemist and scholar with rumored ties to the Templars. In one cryptic letter, he references a vessel made not of clay or gold, but of lineage, sealed for 13 generations. Whether literal or poetic, the timing aligns oddly with the dispersal of Merovingian descendants across noble families. 13 generations from Dagobert the Young would place us in the late Middle Ages, right around the time when these rumors began to surface. Coincidence or prophecy? Now, shift to Portugal, where the Templars, after their fall in France, were reborn as the Order of Christ. Same symbols, same structure, different name. Under this banner, they built monasteries filled with esoteric iconography, crosses with rounded arms, octagonal towers, carvings of bees, lilies, and spirals. In Tamar, the order's headquarters, the church rotunda is shaped like the Temple of Solomon itself. Some believe it served as a holding site, not for treasure, but for knowledge. And then there's Scotland.
According to one compelling narrative, Templar ships sailed north from La Rochelle, escaping Philip's wrath. They landed in Argyll, found refuge among sympathetic clans, and brought with them more than just men. They carried something sacred. Roslin Chapel, built generations later, is filled with bizarre carvings, plants from the Americas long before Columbus, angels playing bagpipes, and yes, bees. And beneath the chapel, sealed vaults that no one is allowed to excavate. The scholarly debate around the Templar treasure remains fierce. Some argue it's pure myth, story layered upon story until fantasy overtook fact. But others point to the consistency of the legends, the recurring symbols, the eerie alignment of architecture and astronomy across continents. If it's myth, it's an incredibly coordinated one. So what became of the treasure? Perhaps it was buried. Perhaps it was divided. Or perhaps, and this may be the most plausible theory, it was never meant to be found, only remembered. Its power lies not in ownership, but in belief, in the possibility that somewhere the truth waits, not in gold, but in blood. That the Grail was not a thing, but a legacy, and that legacy, protected by the Templars, may have been the very reason for their destruction, because truth in the wrong hands can be more dangerous than any sword. Now we descend into fire. Not the flicker of candlelight or the gentle glow of hidden truth, but the roaring flesh, scorching kind. The kind that burns cities, silences centuries, and turns heretics into ash. Welcome to the Albigensian Crusade. A war not against a kingdom or a race, but against an idea, a doctrine, a rumor of knowledge that refused to bow. And deep beneath the rhetoric of purity and reform, the possibility of something even more dangerous, a bloodline. The Cathars, those so-called heretics of southern France, were not merely spiritual dissidents. They were a problem, a threat to doctrine, to hierarchy, and perhaps to the carefully guarded story of Christ. Let's begin with what we know. The Cathars flourished in the Languedoc region during the 12th and early 13th centuries. They believed in dualism, a cosmos split between a good spiritual God and an evil material creator. In their theology, the physical world was a prison, and salvation meant escaping it. They rejected the church's sacraments. They had no priests, no cathedrals. Their perfects, men and women, lived lives of extreme purity and humility. To many, they seemed more Christian than the Christians. But there was something else. Whispers, suggestions that the Cathars held secret knowledge, that they guarded a treasure, that they honored Mary Magdalene not merely as a saint, but as a mother, that they venerated not the cross, but the blood, that their consolamentum, a rite of spiritual liberation, was modeled not on the sacraments of Rome, but on something older, more intimate. Some believe the Cathars were the inheritors of Gnostic traditions smuggled into Europe after the fall of the Temple in Jerusalem. Others claim they possessed ancient texts, scrolls passed down from early Christians, possibly even from followers of Magdalene herself. They believed in reincarnation. They denied the material resurrection of Christ, but most dangerously of all, they may have believed that Christ's true message had been distorted, that his legacy lived on not in Rome, but in blood. And then suddenly, the Church declared war. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. It was unlike any campaign before it. This wasn't a holy war against distant Muslims. It was an internal purge, Christian against Christian, French against French. Entire towns were razed, tens of thousands were slaughtered. At Béziers, the papal legate Arnaud Amalek famously declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Over 20,000 people died in a single day, Cathars and Catholics alike, women,
children, the elderly. Their crime? Living in proximity to ideas the church could not tolerate. What kind of ideas demand that kind of fire? At Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold, over 200 perfects were burned alive in 1244 after a prolonged siege. But here's the part that remains curious. Just days before the fortress fell, a handful of Cathars supposedly slipped away down the steep cliffs under cover of night, carrying something with them. The chronicles never say what. A treasure? A gospel? A secret? Something too precious to burn. Some believe that treasure was knowledge, records of a sacred lineage. Others say it was the physical evidence of that lineage, scrolls, relics, perhaps even a preserved body. Whatever it was, the church wanted it silenced so badly that it committed what many historians now consider cultural genocide. And in the ruins left behind, the silence was nearly complete.
But not quite. Legends endured in the Languedoc, songs, symbols, carvings in stone that no one could translate, bees etched into hidden chapels, grail-shaped fonts in village churches, and the constant, persistent veneration of Mary Magdalene long before she was embraced by the Catholic mainstream. Here's where it becomes unsettling. The regions targeted during the Albigensian Crusade overlap nearly perfectly with the supposed hiding places of the Merovingian descendants. Septimania, the Roses, the foothills of the Pyrenees, the very same places where later legends placed the escape of Sigisbert IV, the son of Dagobert II. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps the Cathars weren't merely spiritual rebels. They were guardians. Think about it. A heretical sect that rejected Rome's authority, embraced the feminine divine, and operated in the same regions where bloodline myths flourished. A sect so dangerous it had to be eradicated with fire and steel. One interpretation, controversial but compelling, is that the Cathars may have been preserving or protecting the secret of the bloodline, that their belief system was not merely theological, but genealogical, that they viewed Jesus not as a distant deity, but as the founder of a human line meant to carry his essence forward, and that Mary Magdalene was not a follower, but a vessel. Historians still argue over the validity of these connections. Some insist there's no proof the Cathars believed anything about bloodlines. But then again, what proof would remain after such a violent purge? Their texts were burned, their traditions obliterated. All that survived were rumors, rituals, and silence. And yet that silence hums in the abbey ruins of Larras, in the broken stones of Montségur, in the soft rustle of olive branches outside Rennes-le-Château. You can feel it, the echo of something not quite gone. Today, pilgrims still walk the Cathar Trail, following paths carved into mountain ridges, stopping at caves said to hold sacred bones. And though few speak it aloud, many believe those caves hold more than martyrdom. They hold memory. So was the Albigensian Crusade just a reaction to doctrinal heresy? Or was it something more, a smokescreen, a scorched earth campaign to destroy the last protectors of a secret too ancient to name? A truth that linked blood to spirit, woman to Messiah, earth to divine. If so, then the flames that consumed Béziers and Montségur were not meant to burn bodies. They were meant to burn lineage.
But blood leaves stains, and memory has roots. And sometimes what fire tries to erase, the earth remembers. Imagine a door, several of them in fact. Massive iron gates guarded by stone saints, silent cameras, and the careful weight of centuries. Behind them lies what may be the most mysterious collection of documents on earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Once called the Secret Archive, not because of its secrecy, but from the Latin secretum, meaning private, it still bears the aura of something carefully, deliberately hidden. And deep within these temperature-controlled vaults, behind meters of locked glass and Latin indexes, some believe the greatest cover-up in history lies filed neatly in silence. Not gold, not relics, but records. If the bloodline of Christ did exist, and if the Church knew of it, then this is where the evidence would be. To walk the halls of the Vatican archive is to touch the breath of popes long dead. It's home to more than 50 meters of shelving, yes, miles, containing documents that stretch back well over a millennium, from the excommunication of Martin Luther to the trial records of the Knights Templar. It's all there. Yet only a handful of scholars are granted access each year. Requests must be specific, approved in advance, and granted by Vatican officials. You don't just browse the shelves. You are guided, watched, limited. What then remains unseen? The first hint that the archive might contain something more than ecclesiastical bureaucracy comes from the gaps. Scholars who have studied medieval church records have noted entire stretches of papal correspondence missing, especially during moments crucial to the Merovingian mystery. Letters from the reign of Pope Zachary, for example, seem to vanish around the time he sanctioned the deposition of the last Merovingian king. Why would a record of such magnitude be absent? And then there's the curious case of Pope Sylvester II. A mathematician and scholar, Sylvester was rumored to possess forbidden knowledge.
Some claimed he had traveled to Islamic Spain, or even beyond, returning with arcane texts. But others whispered that he found something in the early records of the church itself, something that reshaped his beliefs. After his death, his tomb was said to rattle violently whenever a pope of questionable virtue took office. Superstition, perhaps, but superstition usually grows around something. In modern times, very few people have spoken openly about what lies hidden inside. One exception is the late Jesuit priest and theologian, Father Malachi Martin, who claimed vaguely but insistently that the Church had long known of a bloodline. He never offered names. He never offered proof, but he hinted that the knowledge was buried for the safety of souls and the stability of the faith. It's easy to write that off as speculation, until you consider what the Vatican has chosen not to release. For centuries, it was believed that the Church had no direct involvement in the suppression of the Merovingians, that it merely blessed the rise of the Carolingians for political stability. But scattered references in obscure medieval texts suggest otherwise. There are hints of backroom councils, of agreements forged in private, never public, documents that would prove collusion and perhaps even reveal why the Merovingians had to disappear. Now consider this.
The Priory of Sion, the supposed secret order charged with protecting the bloodline, is alleged by some to have had operatives within the church itself. Priests, monks, scribes, men who quietly recorded, encoded, and preserved the truth even as others tried to destroy it. If such a network existed, the archive would be the ultimate battlefield, knowledge locked behind knowledge. There's also the matter of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's list of banned books. Some of the texts on that list were not heretical for their ideas about God, but for their ideas about Jesus. Books that suggested he married, that he fathered children, that Mary Magdalene was more than just a follower. Many of these works, rather than being destroyed, were collected by the Vatican and sequestered. For study, for suppression, no one knows. And still the archive continues to expand. Every year more records are added. Some say that documents from the Templar trials, original, unedited versions, are stored there. Others believe that parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly those that challenge traditional narratives, were quietly acquired and hidden away. There's even a rumor, more folklore than fact, admittedly, that a locked chamber within the archive contains a genealogy, a hand-scribed, meticulously updated record of descent, starting with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, ending with someone still alive today. Let's pause on that idea. It's audacious, outlandish, but imagine the implications. A document that tracks the holy bloodline, century by century, child by child. If such a thing exists, it would be the most powerful piece of paper in human history. It would dismantle the theological structure of Catholicism. It would shift spiritual authority from doctrine to DNA, which might explain why it must never be found. Of course, the Vatican denies everything. It insists the archive is not secret, but just private, that nothing controversial is hidden there, that claims of bloodline records, alternative gospels, or Templar secrets are pure fiction. But then, why do the denials feel so rehearsed? Why guard ancient documents with such care? Why restrict access based not on curiosity, but on permission? What if the truth isn't what's inside the archive, but the fear of what it might inspire? Faith, after all, thrives on mystery, but mysteries that become evidence, they threaten the entire edifice. Still, the archive remains, cold, quiet, watching, and every year a few more scholars slip behind the gates, some looking for knowledge, others perhaps for legacy. Because somewhere in those miles of parchment and ink, the line between religion and blood might be nothing more than a sealed folder, waiting to be opened. Let your gaze drift now far from medieval parchment and hidden vaults. Look instead toward polished thrones, velvet robes, and glittering crowns. Monarchies may feel like relics of the past, but they persist, some ceremonial, others still wielding power. Yet beneath the polished pageantry of modern royalty lies a question most would never dare to ask aloud. Could any of today's noble houses still carry the blood of Christ?
This is the claim, whispered, dismissed, and occasionally shouted, that the Merovingian line never truly died out, that it wasn't extinguished, but simply disappeared into other families, married off, obscured, carefully cultivated through generations, not just preserved, but placed. Let's begin with one persistent and verifiable fact. Many modern European royal families are interconnected through centuries of intermarriage. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and Windsor share common ancestry going back hundreds, even over 1,000 years. That much is historical fact. But when you trace those tangled roots deep enough, some genealogists claim to find Merovingian branches still thriving, quiet, entangled, and surprisingly close to the present. Take the House of Habsburg, for example. Once rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, they intermarried with French and German nobility going back to the Carolingians. But the Carolingians themselves rose to power only after replacing the Merovingians, officially extinguishing the earlier dynasty. Yet certain noble lines connected to Merovingian rulers, especially through the female line, continued on, absorbed into other bloodlines rather than erased. And this is the loophole. Most royal lineages track male descent, but Merovingian blood, if it carried the sacred DNA of Christ, would likely have survived through daughters, granddaughters, noble marriages that slipped quietly into the record books without drawing too much attention. Those women, mostly unnamed in chronicles, could have passed the bloodline forward generation after generation, until their descendants appeared with new surnames, new titles, and old blood. In fact, certain family trees from southern France, nobles with ties to the regions once ruled by the Merovingians, show unbroken lines stretching back to the early Middle Ages. Some names repeat: Dagobert, Clare, Theodoric. These are not popular modern names, yet they persist quietly in genealogies. Are they homages or reminders? This brings us to the work of modern researchers, many controversial, some outright dismissed, who have attempted to map the bloodline. Perhaps the most famous example comes from the now infamous book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which posits that certain aristocratic families in southern France, particularly the Counts of Rosas and the Lords of Rennes, were descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene through the Merovingians. The authors linked this lineage to the modern House of Plantard, a French noble line that Pierre Plantard claimed was the true guardian of the bloodline. Of course, Plantard's claims were riddled with forgeries, contradictions, and myth-making, but buried beneath the embellishments may be fragments of truth. Multiple independent genealogical studies have found that many European royals today, especially through shared descent from Charlemagne, could plausibly trace their ancestry back to early Frankish kings, including, in theory, the Merovingians. Even Queen Elizabeth II, through her descent from Alfred the Great,
and the House of Wessex was claimed by some to have bloodlines that intersected indirectly with early continental nobility. Her dramatic ties via the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha loop back into the web of old Europe's elite, where even the thinnest Merovingian tendril might still linger. But here's where it gets more speculative and controversial. Some believe that the continued survival of monarchies, particularly constitutional ones, serves as a quiet nod to sacred legitimacy. That the symbols, bays, fleur-de-lis, and solar crosses embedded in royal crests, jewelry, and architecture are more than aesthetic choices. They are markers, echoes of the bloodline hidden in plain sight. In Scandinavian heraldry, you can find symbols long associated with Merovingian iconography. In Spanish royalty, the continued veneration of relics tied to Magdalene persists, passed off as Catholic piety, but perhaps rooted in something older. And in Belgium, a nation whose very monarchy was invented in the 19th century, there are whispers that ancient blood still flows behind the constitutional facade. Of course, this all comes with a heaping spoonful of skepticism. Most mainstream historians agree, without DNA evidence, such claims are impossible to verify. Royal genealogy is notoriously complex, filled with apocryphal links, forged lineages, and assumptions based on marriage alliances rather than biological descent.
Poor? What if the lost word is not a name, but a name line? There's historical tension here too. The Catholic Church has long condemned Freemasonry as heretical, going so far as to excommunicate its members. Why such severe opposition? Some say it's because Freemasonry champions reason, not dogma. But others argue that the real reason lies buried deeper, that the Masons preserve stories the Church tried to erase, stories that threaten to shift spiritual authority away from Rome. Now recall that many of the founding fathers of America, Washington, Franklin, Hancock, were Freemasons. They wove Masonic geometry into the very layout of Washington, D.C. The Capitol sits on a hill, the city structured in star-shaped patterns. Obelisks rise like Pharaoh's needles, owls and pentagrams nestle quietly in the architecture, and hidden among the carvings, bees. Were these symbols aesthetic choices or unconscious continuations of something far older? We must address Albert Pike, 19th century Freemason, Confederate officer, and author of Morals and Dogma, one of the foundational texts of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Pike refers repeatedly to the ancient mysteries, secret knowledge passed down through initiatic societies. He never mentions Merovingians directly, but he speaks of kings born not by right, but by sacrifice, men who carried the divine within them and who were hunted for it. Sound familiar? Then there's the legend of the 9 Unknown Men, an Indian esoteric society said to have been founded by Emperor Ashoka to protect dangerous truths. Freemasons have long debated whether they inherited fragments of these ancient guardianships, and some believe the Priory of Sion, alleged protectors of the Merovingian line, operated in parallel or even within Masonic lodges under assumed identities. The most tantalizing suggestion is that some Freemasons were never meant to lead, but to hide.
to obscure the truth behind allegory until the world was ready. That the twin pillars of Boaz and Jachan do not merely mark the entrance to Solomon's temple, but to a story no longer told aloud. The scholarly community remains skeptical, of course. Most Masonic historians insist the fraternity's symbols are moral metaphors, not genealogical codes. But their arguments, while logically sound, often feel incomplete. There's a hollowness in denial that suggests something left unspoken. Because here's the rub. If the Merovingian line survived, and if it was ever encoded into cultural institutions, it wouldn't be in history books. It wouldn't be shouted from pulpits or proclaimed by kings. It would live in silence, in lodges, in rituals no one outside understands, in whispers passed down by torchlight and wine recited in rooms that smell of dust and candle wax. So ask yourself, when a Freemason refers to the great architect of the universe, is he speaking of God or of legacy? A structure built not from stone, but from blood. Picture this. A brittle scroll, rolled tightly and sealed in wax, found in a crumbling chapel tucked away in the Pyrenean foothills. The parchment crackles as it's unrolled. The ink is faded but legible. And the markings, more symbols than words, seem to form a pattern. A star, a path, a cross, and finally, a name. Now imagine it isn't the only one. Across France, Italy, and even the Scottish Highlands, fragments of similar parchments have turned up in private collections, dusty libraries, and long-forgotten family estates. Each seems meaningless on its own, but when viewed together, they whisper of a map, one not drawn for navigation, but for revelation. In the context of the Merovingian code, these artifacts aren't just relics, they're road signs. Let's begin with the Lobino document, an obscure map discovered in the late 20th century, allegedly part of the dossier secret. Yes, those same controversial parchments deposited at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, tying into the Priory of Sion. It shows the region surrounding Rennes-le-Château overlaid with odd lines, geometric shapes, and points marked with initials. Scholars dismissed it as a hoax, too convenient, too neatly connected to the already flamboyant Saunière legend. And yet, the coordinates did align with certain ancient structures, dolmens, chapels, grottos. But more than landmarks, these maps seem to describe alignments, celestial paths tied to solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. Some believe these are remnants of ancient Druidic knowledge, co-opted by early Christians and preserved in secrecy. Others think they're hiding burial sites, not of treasure, but of truth.
More curious still are the diagrams that reference a place known cryptically as Lambeau d'Ois, the Tomb of Kings. Not the biblical site in Jerusalem, but a hidden location in southern France. Allegedly, it's where Dagobert II's body was reinterred after his assassination, far from the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Some claim the tomb contains not just his remains, but scrolls detailing the secret lineage and its continued survival. There's also the Magdalene Trail, an informal pilgrimage route that links Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, where legend holds Mary Magdalene arrived by boat, with a series of chapels, caves, and mountaintops stretching deep into the Occitan landscape. Local folklore often refers to the Lady in Red, a veiled woman said to have visited these sites in the 12th and 13th centuries, sometimes with a child. In nearly every account, she leaves something behind,
a carved stone, a sealed jar, a letter no one dares open. Then there's the curious shepherd's document, supposedly discovered in a private collection near Arles. It's written in a bizarre combination of Latin and Old Occitan, and it speaks of a line of fire passed from the mount to the rose. Some take this as poetic nonsense, but others, those steeped in Masonic or Rosicrucian tradition, read it differently. Fire, mount, and rose are all initiatic symbols, and when arranged visually, the phrase seems to describe a journey from Rennes-le-Château to the Roslin Meridian. Yes, that infamous imaginary line cutting through Saint-Sulpice in Paris, often mentioned in Da Vinci Code-inspired theories. But long before Dan Brown, the Roslin was whispered about by mystics and choreographers who believed certain energies flowed along specific longitudinal pathways. Could the bloodline encoded into this geography have been preserved not in cities, but in lines? Many of the so-called lost manuscripts connected to this theory aren't entirely lost, just inaccessible. Private families in the Languedoc region have long been rumored to possess heirlooms passed down since the time of the Cathars. In 1994, a researcher claimed to have seen a fragment of an illuminated gospel that showed Mary Magdalene seated beside Jesus, her hand resting on her belly, swollen with child. The document disappeared again before any verification could take place. Of course, critics argue that every claim of a hidden map or lost scroll leads nowhere, that for every discovered parchment, there's a dozen fakes, that secret societies and esoteric choreography are distractions from the absence of real evidence. And yet, too many pieces remain that refuse to fit comfortably into the orthodox puzzle. Take the copper-etched diagram allegedly uncovered near Montségur in the 1920s. It shows the fortress surrounded by 5 stars, forming a pentagram, each point corresponding to a local landmark. When plotted on a modern map, the formation remains intact. Local legend calls it the Seal of the Queen. But which queen? The Virgin Magdalene? Or someone born of both bloodlines? And what of the stone engravings near the Château de Blanchefort, where Saunier was often seen wandering at night? Strange runes, half Celtic, half Latin, scar the hillside, marking places where treasure hunters and mystics alike have dug, mostly in vain. Yet each year, people return, drawn not by gold, but by obsession, because they believed the truth was hidden there on purpose, encoded into the land itself. This brings us to a peculiar idea. What if the final proof of the bloodline isn't a document at all? What if it's a location, a single site, obscured by time and intention, containing bones, relics, and perhaps a written account explaining everything? The true Holy Grail, not a cup, but a tomb. No one has found it, but the clues remain scattered across parchment, stone, and rumor. And slowly, with each recovered manuscript and every strange line drawn across a forgotten map, the pattern sharpens not into an answer, but into a path. Now drift with me, far from sleepy French villages and medieval cathedrals, into darker terrain. The air grows colder. The march of boots echoes through alpine passes and candlelit crypts. The time is the 1930s, and the man at the center of it all is Adolf Hitler. But this isn't the story of tanks or treaties. This is about a man obsessed not just with power, but with myth, with bloodlines, relics, and ancient truths twisted into ideology. It's about the Third Reich's secret search for the Holy Grail and what they believed it could prove about themselves. Many know that Hitler's inner circle was fascinated by the occult, but few understand how deeply that fascination burrowed into the machinery of Nazi research. Himmler, the architect of the SS, modeled the organization after a medieval knightly order. Their motto, "My honor is called loyalty." Their insignia, runes drawn from Norse mythology. But beneath the aesthetic lay a goal to prove a mythic Aryan origin for the Germanic peoples. And that quest led them straight into the shadows of the Merovingians. The SS established an institute called the Ahnenerbe, loosely translated as ancestral heritage. It began as a research body, but its real purpose was far stranger. It funded expeditions across Europe and beyond, hunting for artifacts, sacred sites, and documents that could legitimize Nazi racial ideology. Among their most ambitious goals was locating the real Holy Grail, something they believed was more than a cup, something that, in their view, represented a bloodline, a legacy, a claim. Himmler reportedly sent teams into the Pyrenees, the Black Forest, and even Tibet. One of their destinations was Rennes-le-Château. Yes, the same village where Bugeaud amassed his wealth, where so many believed the bloodline secret was uncovered. The Nazis scoured the area. They interviewed locals. They excavated ruins. They believed the Grail had either been hidden there or that clues to its whereabouts had been encoded in local architecture and legend. They weren't just looking for gold. They were looking for lineage. You see, the Nazis believed that the Merovingians were Aryan kings, noble, divine, and unjustly overthrown. Their long hair, their supposed divine origin, and their early conversion to Christianity all marked them as spiritually elevated. Himmler speculated that Dagobert II's assassination had been part of a plot not just to destroy a dynasty, but to bury sacred knowledge. In this twisted view, the bloodline wasn't just holy, it was racially pure, a prototype for their ideology. The Nazi interest in esoteric Christianity extended to the Magdalene as well. Some researchers claimed the SS had translated texts that suggested Mary Magdalene fled to France not as a refugee, but as a vessel, that she bore children, that the Merovingians were her descendants, and, by extension, that the bloodline was both sacred and European. They even studied Cathar legends, particularly the tale that the last Cathars guarded a secret that would one day change the world. Some believed that secret was the Grail. Others thought it was a lineage. Let's pause and breathe here because we're treading in dangerous territory. These beliefs, appropriated, distorted, weaponized, were used to justify unthinkable atrocities. The Nazis weren't seeking truth. They were searching for symbols to sanctify genocide. Their obsession with blood was not about divinity. It was about supremacy. That distinction matters. And yet within their corrupted hunt, fragments of the original mystery resurface. There's evidence that the Ahnenerbe uncovered manuscripts, possibly coded genealogies while exploring southern France. These documents reportedly vanished into Nazi archives, many of which were never recovered after the war. Some whisper that these texts contained references to the Child of the Rose and the Covenant of the Bee. Vague phrases, yes, but familiar ones to anyone tracing Merovingian lore. One of the most bizarre intersections of Nazi interest and bloodline theory involves the Wewelsburg Castle. Himmler intended it as the spiritual center of the SS, a sort of Teutonic Camelot. The castle's floor featured a black sun, a symbol never explained, but linked to cycles of death and rebirth. Rooms were named after legendary knights, and one chamber,
referred to unofficially as the Grail Room, was designed with perfect acoustic resonance. Rumors suggest that rituals were conducted there, meant to channel or awaken something hidden in the blood. Again, this could all be theatrical, myth layered on myth. But Wewelsburg was no accident. It was constructed with the precision of someone trying to align with something, geographically, symbolically, maybe even cosmically. After the war, Allied forces confiscated hundreds of documents from Nazi vaults. Many remain classified or lost. And in the years that followed, reports emerged of strange disappearances, researchers who vanished while investigating Nazi expeditions in France and Germany.
A few had been looking into the same bloodline theory we've traced since Dagobah II. Did they find something, or did they get too close to a secret still protected? It's worth noting that Nazi interest in esoterica didn't die in 1945. Elements of their mythology seeped into post-war occult groups, neo-pagan circles, and conspiracy culture. The bloodline theory, severed from its sacred roots, was hijacked to serve ideologies diametrically opposed to the teachings of Jesus. This isn't a coincidence, it's a warning. The Merovingian code, if it exists, was never meant to exalt one race over another. It wasn't a tool for domination. It was a lineage of interconnection, a link between the human and the divine, the sacred and the earthly. And yet, in the hands of madmen, even the holiest truth can be twisted into a blade. So we must tread carefully. We follow this mystery not for power, not for proof, but for understanding. Because somewhere beneath the rubble of old castles and the ashes of false empires, a story remains, waiting to be reclaimed, not by those who seek to own it, but by those who seek to know it. Now drift your thoughts across the Atlantic. Leave behind the bloodied cathedrals of Europe and the war-ravaged archives of the Old World. Picture a different landscape. Wind-swept Scottish cliffs giving way to dense pine forests, and then the vast and open stillness of early America. You might think the story of the Merovingians ends in Europe, but some believe it didn't end at all. It simply crossed the sea, hidden, preserved, and quietly reborn. And at the center of this theory stands one named Sinclair. The Sinclair family, also known as the St. Clairs of Roslin, have long held a curious place in esoteric legend. Their ancestral seat, Roslin Chapel, is a structure soaked in mystery. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, it defies easy categorization. It is neither purely Catholic nor comfortably Gothic. Instead, it feels like a coded message in stone. Look closer at Roslin's architecture, and you'll see symbols from Christianity, Judaism, Norse mythology, and curiously pre-Columbian plants like maize and aloe. But maize wasn't known in Europe until after Columbus. So how could it appear carved into stone decades earlier? Here's where things get strange. According to Masonic lore and Sinclair family tradition, members of the Sinclair clan traveled to the New World nearly a century before Columbus. One name in particular, Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, is said to have led an expedition in 1398 to what is now Nova Scotia. Some legends even claim he brought with him sacred artifacts and something more. Was it the Grail? Was it scrolls? Was it blood? While mainstream historians dismiss the Sinclair voyage as legend,
the story won't die. In Nova Scotia's Oak Island, yes, that Oak Island, people have searched for centuries for a mysterious buried treasure. Tunnels, booby traps, and strange inscriptions point to something very old and very deliberately hidden. Some say it's Templar gold. Others believe it's Merovingian documentation, proof of the bloodline carried across the sea and concealed under layers of secrecy and soil. And then there's the Westford Knight. This obscure monument in Massachusetts is a faint carving on a granite slab. Believers claim it depicts a medieval knight bearing a sword and shield. Nearby is a marking said to be the Sinclair family crest. Skeptics argue it's just a glacial scratch or a modern fabrication, but still it lingers. Like all the other clues, the connection deepens when you examine the relationship between the Sinclairs and the Templar Knights. The family were known protectors of the Templars during their persecution, and Roslin Chapel, often described as a stone cipher, contains dozens of Templar symbols, including the distinctive double-headed eagle and the iconic red cross. Could the Sinclairs have inherited not just Templar wealth, but knowledge, a legacy handed off as the Templars disbanded under papal decree? One theory suggests that the Prior Dion used families like the Sinclairs as custodians, assigning them guardianship over the bloodline's material history, while the actual descendants faded into anonymity. There's also the legend of the vault beneath Roslin Chapel, a sealed chamber rumored to contain scrolls, genealogies, and relics from Solomon's temple. Despite ground-penetrating radar suggesting the existence of a chamber below the chapel, no excavation has ever been officially allowed. The reasons are practical and suspicious.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, certain American founding families exhibit curious heraldic symbols: bees, fleur-de-lis, solar crosses. In colonial-era architecture and old Masonic lodges, you'll find Roslindike iconography, columns that don't belong, geometry that doesn't match the blueprint. And in Washington, D.C., a city famously laid out by Freemasons, those symbols repeat: pentagrams, owls, and hidden in the angles, remnants of a geometry older than the Constitution. George Washington himself was a known Freemason. His inauguration took place not in a cathedral, but within a Masonic lodge. His compass and square signet ring, preserved in museums, speaks volumes to those fluent in symbols. Could the ideals of American liberty, so often hailed as a break from monarchy, also hide the survival of a different kind of royalty? Here lies one of the more curious ironies. The New World, founded on revolution and democracy, may have become the refuge of a bloodline older than the crowns it rejected. Not to rule, but to endure. Modern genealogists have speculated that certain East Coast families, names you've seen in the halls of Harvard and Yale, may trace distant lineage back to the Merovingians through colonial marriages and European descent. It's not a bold claim, genealogically speaking. By the numbers, millions of Europeans today are statistically likely to descend from Charlemagne. But only a small subset followed the esoteric threads, the whispered ones. The ones that say Charlemagne was not the beginning, but a veil.
Again, we are left with symbols. A 5-petal rose above a courthouse doorway. A twin serpent motif above a library arch. Nothing explicit, but nothing random either. One researcher claims to have found a family Bible in Virginia, passed down since the 1700s, that includes a handwritten notation in Latin, ex sanguine regali, of the royal blood. No context, no explanation, just a quiet assertion hidden in the margins of Psalms. As with everything in this story, the deeper you go, the more the lines blur. What began in Merovingian Gaul and bled through Templar tunnels and Masonic rituals may have crossed an ocean, not as legend, but as legacy. Now ask yourself, if the bloodline had to flee, if the world grew too dangerous for its truth, where would it go? To the land of liberty? To a chapel in stone? Or to a quiet farmhouse in Massachusetts where a granite slab waits patiently in the weeds? Maybe all three, maybe none. But the clues are there, carved, etched, and coded, if you're willing to follow them across the sea. Close your eyes. Now imagine a dim-lit cathedral, not of stone, but of data. Vast halls of hard drives humming with quiet urgency. Shelves of ancient texts rendered into code. Dustless vaults that do not breathe, but remember. We have arrived in the present, but not quite the now you know. This is the new frontier of the old mystery, the search for the Merovingian bloodline in the digital age. For centuries, researchers were constrained by geography and gatekeeping. Access to rare manuscripts required political pull, papal blessing, or centuries of privilege. But today, millions of documents, papal bulls, church records, noble genealogies, even esoteric manuscripts once locked behind Vatican doors are being digitized. And somewhere in that tidal wave of metadata, keyword strings and cross-link annotations may be the code that breaks the silence. Artificial intelligence is already helping genealogists make connections human researchers would have missed. It doesn't tire. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't dismiss what looks like coincidence. It finds patterns, names recurring across centuries, marriages that bridge forgotten dynasties, dates that align with eclipses and rituals and whispered births. The algorithms don't care about orthodoxy. They aren't interested in preserving narratives. They just match data. And lately, they've been finding things. Take, for instance, a project launched quietly by an independent researcher in 2021. Using natural language processing on thousands of scanned ecclesiastical documents from the 13th and 14th centuries, they trained an AI to identify references to non-canonical figures. Individuals mentioned in church records who appeared tied to religious centers but held no official titles. One name came up repeatedly across France, Spain, and southern England. Melina de Serre, always female, always appearing in proximity to royal baptisms, noble weddings, and sudden deaths. The name itself is suspicious.
Madalena, clearly invoking Magdalene. And sangre, a fusion of blood and sacred. Some say it was a priest's code. Others believe it was the pseudonym of a living custodian of the line. Either way, the pattern was clear. She appeared where the legacy needed protecting. That researcher no longer active online. There's also been a renewed digital excavation of the dossier secrets, the infamous Priory of Sion documents. Most had been written off as fabrications, but by applying stylometric analysis, essentially a digital fingerprint of writing styles, some odd inconsistencies emerged. While several documents were clearly penned by Pierre Plantard and Philippe de Chérisy in the mid-20th century, at least one section displayed a writing pattern that matched no known modern author. Its syntax, rhythm, and archaic phrasing aligned more closely with late Renaissance Latinists. A fragment possibly predating its alleged forgers. That fragment, it mentions the anointed blood in exile. The term hadn't appeared in any mainstream literature before 1956, but it's now being echoed in newer documents and in encrypted messages found on esoteric forums. Then there's the explosion of online communities trying to crowdsource the hunt. Reddit boards filled with translated Templar logs, Discord servers that analyze the fresco of Rosslyn Chapel pixel by pixel, even TikTok accounts that track the position of ancient stars over European cathedrals to find ley lines. And in between the nonsense and the noise, something moves, a rhythm, a story. You might laugh, but history has always hidden its truths in plain sight, hoping the right eyes would someday see. And the Vatican? It too has entered the digital age. Their apostolic archive, once the most secretive in the world, has begun to release select scans to the public. But for every scroll available to read, hundreds more remain sealed. AI programs have already flagged anomalous indexing patterns, rooms mislabeled, collections temporarily inaccessible, and keywords scrubbed from databases without explanation. A few particularly controversial collections, those from the early Carolingian period, are marked under review indefinitely. It's almost as if someone else is watching the watchers. The question arises, if you could train a machine to find the Merovingian line, would you? Or more provocatively, has someone already done it? It would only take one powerful foundation, one group with the motive, the funding, and the algorithm, not to reveal the truth, but to hold it quietly, strategically. Because in the age of digital transparency, secrecy requires a new form of silence, invisibility in plain sight. Code written not in ink, but in absence. There's a growing theory that the true custodians of the bloodline, if they still exist, are no longer burying scrolls in tombs or carving messages into stone. They're embedding them in metadata, hash signatures, zero-width spaces, stenographic noise in digital images. A photo of a rose may contain an encrypted name. A cathedral's virtual tour may contain time-stamped echoes of a grail-shaped geotag. You wouldn't know unless you knew how to look. Which brings us full circle, back to the very idea of the Grail. Not as cup, not as scroll, but as signal. Transmitted across time, encrypted into flesh and language, and now, perhaps, into silicon. You can call it conspiracy,
or folklore, or metadata madness. But here we are, 22 chapters deep, and the picture no longer resembles a theory. It's become a network, a lattice of overlapping truths buried by power and unearthed by code. The Merovingian bloodline may not need temples or knights anymore. It may only need a password and someone willing to type it in. Take a breath. Let all the fragments float in your mind. The long-haired kings, the bees, the whispered names in stone, the maps drawn in starlight, the chapel carvings, the hidden archives, the monks, the masons, the Nazis, and the algorithms. It's time now to step back and look again. Not as a skeptic, not as a believer, but simply as someone following a thread. Because after centuries of speculation, silence, and subterfuge, the story of the Merovingian bloodline hasn't dissolved into myth. It has survived quietly, impossibly, deliberately.
Add the chaotic fragmentation of European nobility over centuries of war, reformation, and revolution, and you get a genealogical forest more tangled than readable. But the mystery persists because it feels plausible. After all, isn't this how power survives? Not always through conquest, but through continuity. Through names quietly carried, through sons named for forgotten kings, through blood that remembers what history tries to forget. And then there are the families who never sought crowns, yet quietly claimed descent from Christ. In rural parts of France, Switzerland, and Italy, there are houses, stone, ivy-covered, whose owners keep meticulous records. Genealogies, scrolled in Latin, wrapped in cloth, stored in drawers, never shown to strangers. These people don't seek power, they seek preservation. As if the bloodline, once scattered, chose not to rule, but to wait. An ongoing debate lingers among scholars and amateur sleuths alike. If the bloodline did survive, what does it mean? Would it grant divine authority, spiritual leadership, or would it simply be an inconvenient fact that challenges millennia of dogma? There is no final answer, only hints. A ring passed down, a family crest with a strange symbol, a name on an old parchment, faded but legible. Clovis, Dagobah, Sarah, and somewhere, perhaps today, someone walks through a garden unaware or very aware of the burden in their veins, of a lineage older than kings, heavier than crowns. The question is not whether the bloodline exists, the question is whether it still matters, or whether at some quiet hour, in some quiet house, it is merely waiting. You find yourself beneath vaulted ceilings again. But this time the air is perfumed with incense and old tobacco, not mildew. Velvet drapes, carved oak chairs, aprons embroidered with symbols you only half recognize. The setting is familiar but elusive, a Masonic lodge. And once more the whispers return about a bloodline, about a secret too powerful for daylight. Could the Freemasons, those enigmatic architects of modernity, hold keys to the Merovingian legacy? It's easy to dismiss Masonic lore as theatrical pageantry. Men in sashes conducting strange rituals with swords, candles, and cryptic phrases. But the Freemasons are more than social clubs. Historically, they've attracted scientists, kings, artists, and revolutionaries. And their symbols, well, their symbols speak louder than words. One symbol in particular resurfaces again and again, the beehive. In Masonic iconography, it represents industry, harmony, and collective labor. But to anyone who's been following the trail of the Merovingians, it means something entirely different. Bees were the royal emblem of the Merovingians, found buried with kings, etched into tombs, painted in the margins of medieval manuscripts, and revived briefly by Napoleon Bonaparte, who some believed was trying to link himself to the bloodline through symbology. So when you walk into a Masonic hall and see the beehive nestled between the all-seeing eye and twin pillars, you start to wonder, coincidence or continuity? The Freemasons trace their mythical origins to the builders of Solomon's Temple, the same temple the Knights Templar excavated during their time in Jerusalem. In Masonic lore, Hiram Abiff, the master builder, is martyred for his knowledge, an echo, some believe, of Christ himself. But what if this tale wasn't just allegory? What if it encoded fragments of the Bloodline story, in metaphor and ritual, ensuring its survival not through scripture, but through practice? Ritual is memory wearing a costume. Now consider this. Masonic initiations involve symbolic death and rebirth. They feature passwords, secret handshakes, and elaborate allegories of resurrection. Some claim these rituals are not just moral lessons, but reenactments of a deeper truth, a hidden lineage kept alive through performance. In this view, every initiated Mason becomes not merely a brother, but a vessel of legacy. Many point to the Scottish Rite, particularly its higher degrees, as being especially rich in esoteric symbolism. The Rose-Croix degree, for example, features a ritual death at the hands of persecutors, followed by a resurrection associated not with Christ, but with a divine king. Some versions explicitly reject the Church's interpretation of the crucifixion. Could this be a coded veneration of a different story? One where the divine was not crucified alone, but continued on through blood. Masonic texts and lectures are often cryptic by design, but phrases like the lost word, the true architect, and the royal secret gain an eerie resonance when viewed through the lens of sacred genealogy.
So, what do we actually know? The Merovingians ruled parts of Europe from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Their reign was marked by oddities. Divine right conferred not by coronation, but by their very blood. Their hair, never cut, was said to hold spiritual power. They were Christian, but uncomfortably close to earlier pagan rituals. And then, suddenly, they were overthrown. Not with a war, but with a whisper. The Carolingians replaced them with papal blessing, and history was rewritten almost overnight. Why? Well, because maybe that bloodline carried something the Church couldn't control. Not heresy in the traditional sense, but heritage.
a living legacy that said holiness didn't reside solely in priests, bishops, or Rome, but in people, in blood, in womb, in woman. Think back to Mary Magdalene, recast by early church fathers as a reformed sinner, scrubbed of her potential role as spiritual partner and progenitor. And think again of Dagobert Tukatin, murdered in the forest after years in exile, perhaps because he threatened to reclaim not just a throne, but a truth. Layered atop this, the Priory of Sion, the Templars, the Vatican's missing records, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Sinclairs, the digital breadcrumbs. Over and over, different players arise, but the theme remains. The name. Protect a secret or suppress it. We can't say with certainty that the Merovingians descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. No one alive today can. But here's what we can say. Someone believed it enough to hide it, enough to kill for it, enough to preserve it in art, symbol, architecture, and blood for over 300 years. And if the story was truly nonsense, why has it never gone away? If the lineage was a lie, why spend centuries crafting layers of protection, diversion, and disinformation? Why embed clues in cathedrals, bury maps beneath tombs, smuggle names into genealogies, and commission paintings that show Magdalene not as a disciple, but as a mother? Perhaps the truth has always lived in shadows because it threatens the very structures that defined our civilization. A divine bloodline, born not from heavenly magic, but from human union. One that says the sacred and the human were never meant to be separate. That kings can bleed and God can love. And in that idea, if you really listen, you might hear the echo of something revolutionary. A church built on Peter, but haunted by Mary. A world ruled by emperors, but shaped by secrets. And all of it pointing to a name nearly lost in time. Dagobert, the forgotten king, the exiled blood. The thread that once pulled unravels the fabric of divine right and replaces it with something deeper. Not supremacy, but inheritance. So where does the bloodline live now? In a Scottish vault? In Vatican walls? In a dusty library in Spain? Or walking anonymously down a crowded street, unknown even to itself? Maybe it's not about finding the final heir. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's about remembering that such a legacy was possible, and that power, when hidden, always leaves a trail. A fleur-de-lis carved too deeply, a name passed down quietly, a ritual that doesn't quite belong, a child born to carry something more than memory, a bloodline in the shadows.
So here you are, drifting at the edge of the mystery, where the voices have quieted and the echoes grow faint. You've followed the thread from tombs to temples, cathedrals to castles, symbols to silicon. And now the question that lingers like incense in a forgotten chapel. Was it all a lie, or the most carefully hidden truth in history? Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a library, vast and silent. Somewhere in its deepest corridor lies a single scroll. No title, no author, just a name and a bloodline.
Perhaps it tells of kings who ruled by right of birth, not from nobility, but from divinity. Or perhaps it's just a story embellished, romanticized, woven into legend to soothe the aching need for connection to something greater. History isn't merely facts, it's memory, and memory lies easily but forgets reluctantly. There is no document that proves beyond doubt that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a child. There's no DNA record that places a Merovingian king within the genealogy of the Christ. And yet, what if that's the point? Maybe truth was never meant to be proved, only preserved. And maybe, just maybe, you're part of it. Not in blood, but in curiosity, in the simple act of remembering, reaching, reconstructing. The Church has its reasons. The Templars had their vows. The Freemasons had their riddles. But you, here, now, you have your wonder. And wonder is the most dangerous thing of all because it refuses to be satisfied. Whether this story is real or not, whether the bloodline still flows or has long since dried, doesn't really matter now, does it? What matters is that the symbols endure, the whispers continue. The light in the stained glass still flickers across Magdalene's face, and the truth, or the possibility of it, is still out there, waiting to be found. So, the next time you walk past a cathedral, or stare into a painting, or feel that strange sense that something ancient is watching, maybe you'll remember. Maybe you'll look a little closer. Maybe you'll hear the code pulsing just beneath the silence. And in that silence, the line remains, waiting.